They laughed at the single father in wrinkled clothes. They laughed until he put the tournament's best fighter flat on the ground in 28 seconds. Then, nobody laughed anymore. Mason Hale walked into that arena carrying exhaustion like a second skin, smelling faintly of children's shampoo and cold coffee. He wasn't supposed to win anything. He wasn't supposed to matter. But someone in that building had already decided he needed to disappear, along with the billionaire CEO who made the mistake of noticing him. This is the story of what happened when they underestimated the wrong father. If this story hits different, drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this one travels. The alarm on Mason Hale's phone went off at 4:47 in the morning, 13 minutes before it was supposed to. He was already awake. He'd been awake since 2:15 when Lily had padded into his room in her socked feet, her hair a small disaster, her eyes glassy with fever. She hadn't cried. That was the thing about Lily. She almost never cried. She just appeared beside his bed and said very quietly, "Dad, I don't feel good," and that was all he needed. The next 2.5 hours were a blur of lukewarm washcloths, a thermometer that kept giving different readings, children's acetaminophen measured out carefully in the little plastic cup, and Lily's paperback copy of Charlotte's Web read aloud in the semi-dark until her breathing finally evened out and her forehead stopped burning quite so badly. By the time Mason got back to his own room, there was no point sleeping. He sat on the edge of his mattress and stared at the suit hanging on the back of his closet door. He'd ironed it 2 nights ago. It was already wrinkled. He could not remember if he'd hung it wrong or if the closet was just too small, but the crease across the right shoulder was the kind that didn't come out without a proper iron. And the iron was in the hall closet, and if he went to get the iron, he'd wake Lily, and Lily needed to sleep. So he left the suit the way it was. He showered in 4 minutes. He drank half a pot of coffee standing over the kitchen sink. He wrote a note for Mrs. Paola next door, who had agreed to come over at 7 to sit with Lily for the day. And he taped it to the front door at the exact height where Mrs. Paola would see it without having to look down. He had done this enough times that he knew exactly where Mrs. Paola's eye line hit. He left the apartment at 5:31 in the morning in a wrinkled suit with a crease across the right shoulder and a travel mug of cold coffee, and the particular kind of tiredness that isn't really tiredness anymore. It's just the baseline. It's just the air you live in. He did not think he was going to win anything that day. He was just trying to show up. The Harwick Convention Center sat on the edge of downtown like something that couldn't decide if it wanted to be impressive or intimidating and had settled on both. It was a glass and steel structure that caught the early morning light and threw it back in your face, and the parking structure alone was the size of a small stadium. By the time Mason arrived, there were already 40 or 50 people milling around outside the main entrance. He stood at the edge of the crowd for a moment and assessed. They were, almost without exception, exactly what you'd expect. Most of them were male, late 20s to early 40s, the kind of physical specimens that came from years of dedicated training and enough protein and the freedom to organize your life around those two things. There were crew cuts and tactical boots and jacket sleeves rolled just so to show forearms that made a statement. There were the loud ones, already working the room, shaking hands, making eye contact that lasted a beat too long, doing the invisible math of every competitive environment. Who's the threat? Who's not? Who do I need to impress? Mason was not loud. He stood near the entrance and drank the rest of his cold coffee and watched. The competition was called the Sterling Security Summit Selection, an invitation-only event run by Sterling Consolidated, one of the largest private holding companies on the East Coast. They were recruiting for what the invitation had called a high-tier executive protection and strategic security advisory role. The language had been deliberately vague. The money had not been vague at all. Mason had been invited because a former colleague, someone who knew what he used to be before he became a single father in a small apartment with a daughter who got fevers at inconvenient times, had submitted his name without telling him first. He'd almost declined. He'd thought about it for a week, actually. He'd sat with it. He'd looked at Lily's school calendar and her medical bills and the heat bill for last winter and the way his refrigerator made a sound now that it hadn't used to make. And then he'd sent the confirmation email and told himself it was just one day. Just one day? And then whatever happened, happened. Nice suit. He turned. The man next to him was maybe 6'2", built like a defensive end in the off-season, with a jaw that seemed architecturally designed to convey confidence. His own suit was immaculate, clearly custom, clearly pressed that morning. He was smiling, but the smile was the kind that didn't reach the eyes because it wasn't supposed to. It was a dominance display wearing the mask of friendliness. "Thanks," Mason said. "You ironed that yourself?" The man's eyes moved over Mason's shoulder crease with the satisfaction of someone who had already placed him. "Didn't have time." "Big night?" "Thick kid." The man, whose name tag, Mason noticed, read Derek Calloway, Calloway Protective Services, seemed to recalibrate slightly. Not out of sympathy, more like reassigning Mason to a lower tier in the invisible ranking he'd already constructed. "That's tough," Calloway said, in a tone that meant the opposite. "You should have rescheduled." "Couldn't." Calloway smiled wider and moved on, sliding into a different conversation with two other candidates who had the look of people who'd worked private military contracts. They were already laughing about something. Mason watched the body language, the way they angled away from anyone they deemed unimportant, the way they grouped instinctively, pack animals dressed in business casual. He turned back to the building and watched the glass doors instead. There were 6 security personnel visible from where he stood. 3 at the entrance, 1 near the parking structure elevator, 2 at what appeared to be a service entrance around the side. Standard placement. He'd counted them automatically, the way you count exits in a restaurant or steps in a stairwell, not because you're paranoid, just because the part of your brain that was trained to do it never really stops. He also noticed the camera above the left entrance door was pointing 3 degrees off axis. It was subtle. It could be nothing. Cameras shifted over time, vibration, maintenance, wind pressure. Could be nothing. He filed it away. The doors opened at 6 sharp, and the crowd flowed inside. The main hall had been converted into a combination of examination floor and spectator arena, which told Mason immediately that this was not just a selection process. It was a performance. Someone wanted an audience. The ceiling was 40 feet high and lined with catwalks. A raised platform at the far end held what appeared to be VIP observation seating, glass-fronted, elevated, deliberately positioned so that anyone up there could see everything below without being particularly visible themselves. The kind of design that communicated hierarchy without having to say a word about it. The floor was divided into stations: physical assessment, tactical scenario evaluation, situational judgment panels, communication screening, medical emergency response. Mason moved through the registration desk, collected his number, 47, and found a folding chair near the back of the candidate area where he sat down, set his empty travel mug under the chair, and closed his eyes for approximately 90 seconds. It wasn't sleep, it was just quiet. He'd learned to find quiet in very small windows a long time ago. "You actually sleeping?" He opened his eyes. The person next to him was a woman, early 30s, short natural hair, expression of someone who had seen enough to be past the point of being impressed by rooms like this. Her number was 31. Her handshake, when she offered it, was direct and brief. "Nadia Reeves," she said. "Mason Hale." "You look terrible." "Sick kid," he said again. How old?" 7. She nodded, like that answered something. "Mine are 9 and 11. The 9-year-old just got over strep." She paused. "You actually qualified for this, or you one of those legacy invites? Someone submitted my name." "Someone who knew you, or someone who owed you?" Mason almost smiled. "Knew me. What'd you do before?" He looked at the floor for a moment. It was a question he always paused on, not because the answer was complicated, but because the editing process was. What he said was, "Government work. I got out." Nadia studied him for a second, then nodded slowly. She had the eyes of someone who understood that some answers were complete even when they weren't detailed. "Fair enough," she said. "I did 12 years federal protective detail. Decided I wanted to be home for dinner sometimes. Good reason to get out. What was yours?" He thought about Lily at 2 a.m, with her socked feet on the cold floor and her glassy eyes and her quiet, patient voice saying, "Dad, I don't feel good." "Same kind of thing," he said. The morning session started at 7 and ran through a series of assessments that Mason moved through without particular drama. The written portion, tactical decision-making under pressure, threat assessment scenarios, incident command protocol, he completed in 40 minutes where most candidates took the full hour. He didn't rush, he just didn't second guess. The answers were either right or they weren't, and spending extra time staring at them rarely changed which one they were. Physical screening came second, mile-and-a-half run, obstacle course, strength metrics. Mason posted numbers that were solid without being spectacular, and he noticed that the candidates around him, the ones who'd been performing all morning, walking a little louder, standing a little straighter, were watching each other more than they were watching the course. There was a man named Torres who finished the run 30 seconds ahead of everyone else and immediately looked around to confirm that people had noticed. Mason's time was 45 seconds behind Torres. He didn't look around. The thing about being good at something is that it doesn't require a witness. He'd learned that a long time ago, in circumstances where having a witness would have gotten him killed. By mid-morning, there were about 30 candidates left in active competition. The registration desk had quietly stopped calling certain numbers. The ones who weren't called anymore just drifted toward the exits, some with dignity, some without, and the room got smaller. At 10:30, they announced the combat assessment. The fighting area had been set up in the center of the hall, a square of padded flooring, 40 feet on each side, ringed with the kind of low rope barriers that are less about containing the fighters and more about defining the theater. Candidates would be evaluated on defensive technique, threat neutralization, and controlled aggression management. The point wasn't to knock someone out. The point was controlled, efficient, effective response. At least that was what the rules sheet said. In practice, the room had taken on the energy of something a little less structured than that, because the event coordinator had made the decision, possibly for entertainment purposes, possibly because the people in the glass booth upstairs found it useful to watch candidates under real psychological pressure, to have the candidates matched based on the morning's performance rankings, which meant the top-ranked candidate from the morning session would face the highest-tier competitor available. That competitor's name was Roman Varick. Roman Varick was not hard to identify. He was 6'3", 230 pounds, of the kind of muscle that came from being very serious about fighting for a very long time. He was 36, former Eastern European military, rumored to have competed in private circuits in at least 4 countries. He had a scar that ran from his left ear to his jaw, and the absolute stillness of a man who had never been particularly afraid of other men. He had already been through 2 preliminary matches, both of which he'd ended quickly and cleanly, and the room had noticed. When Mason's number was called to face him, there was a moment of silence. Then someone laughed. It wasn't a mean laugh, exactly. It was the involuntary laugh of a person confronted with something that seemed genuinely absurd. And then other people laughed too, because laughter is social, because Mason looked exactly as he had when he walked in, tired, slightly wrinkled, unremarkable. And Varick looked like a monument to the concept of physical threat. Derek Calloway's voice carried from across the room. "They're serious with this?" Someone else. "They running a charity bracket?" Mason heard all of it. He always heard things. He just didn't respond to them, because the time to respond to words is after the situation is resolved, not during. He stepped onto the padded floor. Varick looked at him the way a very large dog looks at something it isn't certain is worth the energy. Not contempt, exactly, more like a professional assessment that had arrived at a preliminary conclusion. The match coordinator gave the signal. Varick moved first. A controlled advance, probing, watching for the flinch response, the tell, the thing most people did in the first 2 seconds that revealed everything about how they were going to fight. He was methodical. He'd done this enough times to know that the first exchange was information, not resolution. Mason didn't move. He stood with his weight slightly forward, hands at his sides, watching. Varick came in with a controlled grab. Right hand for the collar, setting up a throw, textbook, and very clean. And Mason was not where he was supposed to be. He'd stepped inside the arc of the grab rather than away from it, which was wrong, which was not what you did, which threw off the geometric assumption the throw was built on, and in the same motion he'd redirected Varick's arm at the elbow, used the big man's forward momentum like a door swinging on a hinge, and Varric was going down before he'd finished processing that the opening exchange had gone incorrectly. The floor hit Varric hard. Mason stepped back. He didn't follow up, didn't press the advantage, didn't perform. He just waited. Varric was on the ground for 1 second, 2, 3, the match coordinator called it. 28 seconds. The room was quiet the way a room gets quiet when the thing that just happened doesn't fit the category that was prepared for it. The laughter had stopped. The side conversations had stopped. Even Calloway, across the room, had his mouth closed. Varric sat up slowly. He turned to look at Mason, and his expression had changed. Not angry, not embarrassed, but the very specific look of a serious professional who has just been shown something he didn't know was possible. He nodded once, a small, contained movement. Mason nodded back. That was all. High above the floor, in the glass-fronted observation suite, Victoria Sterling set down her water glass. "Who is that?" she said. Her head of current security operations, a careful man named Hargrove who had worked for her company for 6 years, was already consulting the candidate roster on his tablet. Number 47, Mason Hale, independent applicant submitted by a third-party referral. He scrolled briefly. Background check came back clean, but thin. There are gaps. Gaps. Employment history, years 4 through 9. Some kind of federal notation on the file, redacted. Could be standard government service, could be... He paused. Something else. Victoria watched Mason walk off the padded floor. He moved the way very few people moved in rooms like this, but like the room wasn't performing for him, and he wasn't performing for it. He found his chair, sat down, and reached under the seat for his travel mug, which was obviously empty, and looked into it for a moment anyway. "Pull everything you can find," she said. "Already on it." She watched him a little longer. He was talking to the woman with the short hair, Reeves, 31, and whatever he was saying, it made her laugh. Victoria had been running the Sterling Consolidated Security Summit for 3 years. She'd found 4 exceptional hires through it. She knew what exceptional looked like in this room, and she knew what exceptional felt like, which was a different thing. This felt like something else, something she didn't quite have the right word for yet. "Hargrove," she said. "Ma'am. Make sure he advances to the afternoon sessions." Hargrove paused, checked the morning scores. He already qualified on his own. "Good," she said, and looked back down at the floor. That Lily had sent him a text at 9:47 that said, "Mrs. Paula made eggs. I feel better. Do your best, Dad." Heart emoji. Mason read it during the lunch break, standing in the hallway outside the men's room, and he had the particular experience of feeling 2 completely separate things at the same time. Relief so clean and immediate it was almost physical, and the specific loneliness of experiencing that relief alone, without another adult to say, "Oh, good to." He texted back, "Glad you feel better. Eat something. I'll be home by dinner." Then he put his phone away and went to get coffee from the refreshment table. Nadia was already there, stirring something into a paper cup with a red plastic straw. "Varric is talking about you," she said. "What's he saying?" "Nothing, actually. He's just standing near the windows not saying anything, which I think is its own kind of statement." She glanced sideways at him. "Where did you learn to do that?" "Do what?" She gave him a look. "The thing where you moved inside the grab instead of..." "Physics," he said. "Mason." "I'm serious. He had a lot of momentum and a very specific expected trajectory. And the most efficient thing to do with a moving object is redirect it rather than stop it." He paused. "Plus he telegraphed the shoulder drop about half a second before." Nadia stared at him. "You saw that in half a second?" "I saw it before he moved." She stared at him a little longer. Then she turned back to her coffee. "Okay," she said, in the tone of someone recalibrating something privately. "Okay. Good to know. Well, the afternoon sessions were different in character from the morning. The physical demonstrations were done. What remained was the scenario work, the kind of assessment that was harder to train for because it didn't test what you knew. It tested who you were when the situation got complicated. They ran them through a hostile motorcade extraction, a simulated attack on a moving vehicle convoy with incomplete information about the threat source and 4 competing protective priorities. They ran them through a crisis communication scenario, a hostage situation in a corporate office with a CEO on site, and a board of directors making contradictory demands via phone. They ran them through a surveillance detection exercise, a walk through a mock-up of a hotel lobby and convention floor where 7 threat indicators had been seeded into the environment. Candidates were scored on identification rate, prioritization accuracy, and response decision quality. On the motorcade extraction, Mason's team finished with all 4 priorities intact. He'd done it by making a decision in the first 30 seconds that the other team leaders hadn't made. He'd accepted that the primary vehicle was compromised and rerouted, rather than trying to defend a position that was already lost. Some candidates argued with that assessment afterward. Mason didn't argue back. On the crisis communication scenario, he'd gotten a board member to stop calling by explaining, very calmly, that the next phone call from that number would be forwarded to the situation coordinator as evidence of interference, and that the board member was welcome to explain that to the insurance underwriters. The scenario coordinator had actually written something down when that happened. On the surveillance detection exercise, he identified 6 of the 7 planted threats. The 7th was a woman in a hotel uniform near the service entrance who appeared completely natural in the environment. He'd noted her, actually. He'd noticed that she was holding a tray at an angle that would be uncomfortable to maintain if the tray was loaded the way it appeared to be, which suggested the tray was lighter than it looked, which suggested the items on it weren't what they appeared to be. He'd marked her as possible rather than confirmed because he hadn't been certain. When the exercise concluded and the debrief happened, she turned out to be the planted threat he'd missed. The scenario coordinator asked him what he'd seen. Mason described the tray angle. The coordinator looked at him for a moment. "You saw that?" "Yes. And you marked her possible rather than confirmed." "I wasn't certain." "But you saw it." "I saw something. I wasn't certain what it meant." The coordinator made another note. "Most candidates missed her entirely," he said. "Not like a compliment, just like a fact being stated for the record." Mason nodded. He thought about the camera above the left entrance that had been pointing 3 degrees off axis. He was still thinking about that. By 3 in the afternoon, the candidate pool had been reduced to 8. The remaining 8 were brought to a conference room on the 2nd floor and given water and a brief statement from the event coordinator, a composed woman named Albright, who had the effect of someone who had run many processes like this and found them professionally interesting rather than personally engaging. "The final assessment will begin at 4, she said. "It will involve live scenario work in the main hall with active participation from Sterling Consolidated executive staff. You'll be evaluated on real-time performance, and final selections will be made by end of day." She left. The door closed. The 8 remaining candidates sat around the conference table. Calloway was still there, which didn't surprise Mason. The man was genuinely good. His performance in the afternoon sessions had been legitimately strong. Varick was there, which also didn't surprise Mason. Torres was there. Nadia was there. 3 others Mason had tracked through the day but not spoken to. Calloway leaned back in his chair and looked around the table with the particular confidence of someone who had already decided how the day ended. "Final 8, he said. "Pretty good company." "Middling, actually," Nadia said without looking up from her water bottle. Calloway smiled. "You're Reeves, right? Federal background?" "Yes." "Solid resume." He looked at Mason. "What about you, Hale? What's your resume look like?" "I didn't bring one," Mason said. A beat. "Seriously?" Torres said. "They didn't ask for a hard copy." "Most people bring one anyway." "I'm not most people." Calloway studied him. The competitive assessment was happening again, but it was different now from what it had been that morning. Something had shifted. The morning's laughter was gone, and in its place was something more complicated. Not respect exactly, not yet, but the specific absence of certainty. Calloway didn't know what he was dealing with, and he was smart enough to know that he didn't know. "You have kids?" Calloway asked. "One, 7-year-old girl." "And you're trying to get into executive protection? That's a demanding field. Travel, irregular hours, proximity to high-risk environments." "I'm aware of the field." "Does she know what you used to do?" For work? Mason looked at him steadily. She knows I keep people safe, he said. She thinks that's enough. Calloway held his gaze for a second, then looked away. Under the table, Mason's hand rested flat on his thigh. He was still thinking about the camera. He was thinking about the access records he'd glimpsed on the coordinator's tablet during the scenario debrief. A timestamp anomaly. A 2-minute gap in the log that shouldn't have been there if the morning security sweep had been run correctly. He was thinking about the staff member he'd seen near the service entrance during the lunch break. A man in a gray uniform who'd been walking with the kind of practiced casualness that only people who are practiced in deception walk with, and the badge that had been facing the wrong way on the lanyard. He was thinking about the delayed camera, the access log gap, the reversed badge. He was thinking 3 is not a coincidence, but he didn't say any of this. Not yet. Not in a room where he didn't know who was listening. He drank his water and watched the clock and waited for 4 o'clock. What happened just before 4 o'clock was something he hadn't anticipated. He was in the hallway, outside the conference room, on the phone with Mrs. Paula. Lily's temperature had gone back up, nothing alarming, but back up. And he was half listening to Mrs. Paula describe the temperature reading and half watching the corridor the way he always watched corridors, which is how he saw it. The man in the gray uniform, the one with the reversed badge, came through a door at the far end of the hallway. He was moving differently now. The practiced casualness was gone. He was moving with purpose, and he was carrying something. A case, equipment case. Black, the kind with foam-cut interiors. And he was moving toward the stairwell that led to the building's sublevel. Mrs. Paula, Mason said, I'll call you back in 20 minutes. Give her the medicine. She'll be fine. He ended the call. He watched the man reach the stairwell door and push through it, and the door swung shut. Mason stood in the hallway for 4 seconds. Then he walked, not ran, toward the stairwell door, and he went through it after the man with the reversed badge and the black equipment case. The sublevel of the Harwick Convention Center was utilitarian, the way backstage areas always are. Concrete floors, exposed pipe, fluorescent lighting that hummed at a frequency just below comfortable. It smelled like cleaning products and recycled air and the particular cold of spaces that were never meant for long occupation. Mason came down the stairs quietly and stopped at the landing. The man with the reversed badge was 40 feet ahead, at a junction of 2 corridors. He had set the equipment case on the floor and was crouching over it. He had not heard Mason, because Mason had spent 8 years learning to move in ways that people didn't hear, in environments considerably less controlled than this. Mason watched. The case was open. The man was handling something, communication equipment. Mason could see partial components. And he was also talking. Earpiece in. Low voice. Mason couldn't hear all of it. He heard enough. In position by 4. The main floor exits get locked on the signal. A pause. Yeah. Both teams staged in Sector 3 and Sector 5. The woman doesn't leave the building until it's done. The woman. Mason stayed very still. Hale's the variable. If he's as good as the morning suggested, he needs to be separated from... The voice dropped lower for a moment, then, yeah. Use the kid if you have to. He won't leave her. Mason's heart did something controlled and specific that wasn't quite fear and wasn't quite anger. It was the thing that happened when a situation crystallized from complicated to clear, when all the ambiguity collapsed into a single point of fact. They knew about Lily. They had done their homework on the candidates, or at least on him, and they knew about Lily, and they were planning to use her as a mechanism to neutralize him, which meant this was not a random attack. This was choreographed. This was planned by someone with access to candidate files, building schematics, security personnel schedules, and enough lead time to position teams inside the event. This was an inside job. Mason moved backward up the stairs without making a sound. At the top of the landing, he stood in the corridor and did what he always did when the situation changed. He stopped performing and started thinking. He had approximately 40 minutes before the final assessment began. He had the main hall, which he'd already mapped. He had 8 remaining candidates, most of whom he didn't know. He had a building with at least 2 compromised security staff members that he'd identified, plus however many he hadn't. and he had a 7-year-old girl 12 miles away with a fever who someone had just indicated they might try to use against him. He took out his phone. He called Mrs. Paula. "Mrs. Paula," he said when she answered, "I need you to do something for me, and I need you not to ask me why. Can you take Lily to your sister's house for the rest of the afternoon? The one in Maplewood?" "Oh, well, yes, I suppose, but is everything... Everything's fine. I just need her somewhere different for a few hours. Take a different route than usual, please. Call me when you get there." A pause. Mrs. Paula had been his neighbor for 4 years. She had learned certain things about him by proximity, not through questions, just through attention. "All right, Mason," she said, in the voice she used when she understood that something was happening that she was not going to be told about. "We'll go to Rose's. I'll call when we arrive." "Thank you," he said. He hung up. Then he thought about Victoria Sterling in the glass observation suite, looking down at the floor with the focused expression of someone who took threats seriously, and he made a decision. He needed to find a way to warn her, without tipping off whoever was listening. In the next 38 minutes, he straightened his jacket. He checked the crease on his shoulder. Still wrinkled. He walked back toward the conference room. Waltz. The final assessment announcement brought everyone back to the main hall at 4 o'clock sharp, and Mason used the movement and noise of 30 people filing into position to do the thing he needed to do. He identified Hargrove, Victoria Sterling's head of security operations, the careful man he'd seen consulting the tablet in the observation suite during the morning, by the standard tells of a protection professional in an environment they're responsible for. The way he stood with his back to the wall when possible, the slight angle of his body toward the principal's last known position, the earpiece and the half-second scanning pattern he ran on every unfamiliar face. Mason walked past him and said very quietly, without stopping or looking at him directly, 3 threats inside the building, sub-level junction corridor, communication equipment in position, exit locks compromised. Your principal is the target. I have confirmation." He kept walking. He heard Hargrove not move for 2 full seconds, the freeze of a professional processing information that was simultaneously alarming and credible, and then the soft sound of a man changing his trajectory without appearing to change it. Good, Mason thought. He found his position on the floor. He looked up at the glass observation suite. Victoria Sterling was looking back down at him. He could not read her expression from this distance. He couldn't tell what Hargrove had or hadn't said, or whether she was looking at him because he was interesting or because Hargrove had already gotten to her. What he could see, from his position on the floor, was the service entrance to the left of the main hall, where the door had just opened 4 inches and then stopped. He noted the time. 3:59 p.m. He took a breath, and he waited for everything to begin. Lily texted him at 4:02, just as the final assessment briefing was starting. "Mrs. Paula says we're going on an adventure. I brought Charlotte's Web. Is everything okay?" He typed back under the table, one-handed, eyes forward. "Everything's okay. Have a good adventure. I love you." Her reply came 11 seconds later. "I love you too. Be safe, Dad." Heart emoji. He locked the phone. He was already watching the service entrance door. The briefing continued. The assessment coordinator described the final exercise. The remaining candidates listened or appeared to listen. The lights in the main hall were bright, and the crowd that had gathered, staff, observers, evaluation personnel, filled the space with the ambient noise of a large gathering. The service door didn't open again, but Mason counted the seconds, and he watched, and he kept his hands still and his breathing steady, and he thought, 38 minutes is enough time to set something irreversible in motion. He thought, whatever is coming, it's coming before the hour. He thought, don't move until you know where all the pieces are. The briefing ended. The assessment coordinator said the final exercise would begin in 10 minutes. Mason looked at the camera above the left entrance, the one that had been 3 degrees off axis since that morning. It had moved, not back to its original position. It had moved to a new position, pointing down at the primary exit door. Someone had repositioned it manually recently to make sure that particular exit would not be on any recording. His jaw tightened. There it is, he thought. He looked up at the glass observation suite one more time. Victoria Sterling was still there. She had not moved. She was looking at something on her phone. And then she looked up, and for just a moment, across the 40 feet of air and glass between them, she looked directly at him. He didn't know if she could see his expression clearly. He gave her the smallest possible nod. Hey, I see it. I'm ready. She held his gaze for 2 seconds. Then she turned to say something to Hargrove. Mason looked back at the floor. He felt the room change, that barely perceptible shift in atmospheric pressure that preceded the moment when something stopped being preparation and became real. 9 minutes. He made sure he knew where every door was. He made sure he knew where every exit was. He made sure he knew where the service entrance was, and the stairwell, and the distance from his current position to the 3 locations where he'd identified likely threat staging. He thought about Lily in Mrs. Paola's sister's car, probably reading Charlotte's Web in the back seat, probably feeling better. He settled his weight. He waited. The 9 minutes passed the way 9 minutes always pass when something bad is coming. Too fast in the wrong places and too slow everywhere else. Mason counted the seconds without meaning to. It was an old habit, the kind that had kept him alive in environments where the difference between 9 minutes and 8 minutes 45 seconds was not academic. He watched the service entrance door. He watched the repositioned camera above the left exit. He watched the 11 staff members currently visible on the main floor, running the same baseline comparison he'd been running all day. How they moved, where they positioned, what their eyes did when they thought no one was looking at them. 3 of them were wrong. Not obviously wrong. Not wrong in a way that would register to someone who hadn't spent years learning the specific grammar of people who were pretending to be somewhere they belonged. It was small things. The way one of them kept his right hand slightly away from his body at a consistent angle. The way another checked the same point of entry 4 times in 6 minutes without appearing to look at it. The way the third one never made eye contact with any of the candidates, which was the tell that mattered, because in a room full of professionals being evaluated, every real staff member glanced at the competitors at least occasionally out of natural human curiosity. These 3 didn't. These 3 were waiting. The assessment coordinator announced the beginning of the final exercise, and the room reorganized itself. Candidates moving toward the designated starting positions, observers shifting to the periphery, the ambient energy of the space compressing into something more focused. Mason moved with the group and put himself where he needed to be, which was not where his assigned position was. His assigned starting marker was near the center of the floor. He angled gradually toward the left side, close enough to the service entrance to have a line of sight on it, far enough that the movement didn't announce itself. Nadia, who had been tracking him without appearing to track him for most of the afternoon, appeared at his left shoulder. "You're not going to your position," she said quietly. "No." "You want to tell me why?" He thought about it for half a second. Nadia Reeves had 12 years on federal protective detail. She had good instincts, and she wasn't performing, and she wasn't part of whatever was being planned. He was reasonably certain of that. But reasonable certainty wasn't certainty, and he'd already taken one risk today by flagging Hargrove. On the other hand, what was coming in the next few minutes was going to be easier with 2 people than 1. "Service entrance," he said. 3 planted personnel on the floor. Camera above exit 1 was manually repositioned in the last 40 minutes to eliminate that exit from recording. Someone in sub-level junction corridor has communication equipment staging the lockdown sequence. Nadia didn't respond immediately. A beat passed. 2. "You confirmed this," she said. It wasn't a question. "I heard part of the communications personally. Enough." Another beat. He could feel her processing it, not doubting him, just running it against her own observations, checking for the fit. "The man by the east pillar," she said. "Right hand positioning." "Yes." "I clocked that 20 minutes ago and couldn't figure out what bothered me. He's carrying something compact, left side holster, which is why he keeps the right hand offset. He's left dominant, and the balance is off." He paused. "They're here for Sterling. The competition was the mechanism to get her in a controlled environment." Nadia exhaled slowly through her nose. "Who told you about the camera?" "Nobody. I noticed it this morning. It was 3 degrees off axis when I arrived. Someone corrected it to a new position this afternoon." She was quiet again. On the floor, the assessment exercise was beginning. A simulated extraction scenario, candidates receiving radio communications about a hostile approach on a corporate principle. Most of the remaining 8 were running the exercise in good faith, adjusting to the scenario, making decisions. Mason was running a different exercise entirely. "What do you need?" Nadia said. He looked at her. "I need eyes on the North Corridor access point. If they're staging the lockdown from sub-level, the trigger point will be topside. North Corridor has the primary junction access for the main floor exit systems. And you?" "Service entrance and whoever is upstairs." Nadia nodded once, the compact professional nod of someone switching modes. She didn't ask him how he knew any of this. She didn't ask for his credentials or his background or the story behind the government file with the redacted years. She just looked at the floor for 2 seconds, then at the North Corridor, then back at him. "If this goes wrong," she said, "I want it on record that you were the one with the theory." "Fair." She moved away naturally, absorbed back into the flow of candidates repositioning for the exercise. And Mason watched her go and thought that whoever had invited her to this selection had made a good call. He turned back to the service entrance. The door was still 4 inches open. Up in the observation suite, Victoria Sterling had been on her phone for 6 minutes, and it had been, without question, the worst 6 minutes of her professional day. The encrypted message had arrived at 3:47 p.m., 13 minutes before the final assessment, from a source she didn't recognize on a channel that should have been impossible to access without internal authorization. It was 6 sentences long. She had read it 3 times and then handed her phone to Hargrove without a word. And Hargrove had read it, and his expression had done something careful and controlled that meant he was managing a response that his face wanted to make differently. The message said, in very plain language, that the Sterling Security Summit had been compromised from within the company's own operational structure. It said that the event had been designed not as a legitimate recruitment exercise, but as a mechanism to place Victoria in a secured environment where her personal protection detail could be replaced, her communications could be intercepted, and the resultant vulnerability could be used to force a governance crisis at the board level. It said that 3 named individuals within Sterling Consolidated's Executive Operations Division had authorized the operation, and it included authentication codes that should not have existed outside of internal company channels. It also said the candidate numbered 47 has already identified the threat. Trust his assessment. She had looked at Mason Hale standing on the floor below her, and then Hargrove had appeared at her shoulder 2 minutes later and relayed word for word what Mason had said to him in the corridor. 3 threats inside the building: sub-level junction corridor, communication equipment in position, exit locks compromised. Your principal is the target? I have confirmation. She'd said, "Who is he?" Hargrove had said, "I'm still working on that." She'd said, "Work faster." Now Hargrove was on a secondary phone in the corner of the observation suite, and Victoria was standing at the glass looking down at the main floor and thinking about several things at the same time with the particular quality of focus she'd developed over 10 years of running a company where people regularly underestimated her and paid for it. She was thinking about the 3 names in the encrypted message. She knew all 3 of them. 2 she'd hired personally. 1 she'd promoted twice. She was thinking about the board meeting scheduled for Thursday, 6 days from now, where a no-confidence motion had been quietly circulated among 4 board members. A motion she'd been told was procedural, low stakes, the kind of thing that got tabled without significant discussion. The kind of thing that only becomes significant if the CEO arrives at the meeting in a weakened position. If, for example, her personal security infrastructure had been compromised in a public and documented way. If she'd been attacked in her own carefully arranged event, and the story became Sterling couldn't even protect herself at her own security conference. She was thinking about how elegant it was. Ugly, but elegant. And she was thinking about the man on the floor below. The wrinkled suit, the tired eyes, the way he'd put Roman Varick on the ground in 28 seconds without looking like he was trying. And the message that said trust his assessment, and whether she was the kind of person who trusted a stranger on the basis of an anonymous encrypted note in one very impressive combat demonstration. She decided she was, in this specific instance. "Hargrove," she said. He looked up from the secondary phone. "Get me everything on Mason Hale, not the public record, everything. I've been trying. His federal file is... I know what it is. Find someone who can open it." She turned back to the glass. "And get our external team in position. Not the event security. They're compromised. Our people. The ones who came with us this morning. They're in the parking structure. Get them inside. Quietly. Ma'am, if we move them invisibly, whoever is running this will... I said quietly, Hargrove. I didn't say visibly. She looked at him. That's the distinction. Can you manage it? He straightened slightly. Yes. Good. How long? 8 minutes. You have 5. He got back on the phone. Victoria looked back down at the floor. Mason had moved. He was no longer in his assigned position. He was near the left side of the hall, angled toward the service entrance, and he was doing what she'd been watching him do all day. Standing still in a way that looked like nothing but was actually everything, like a person with the volume turned all the way down, watching. She thought about the morning. She thought about the way he'd walked in and the way the room had received him, and the way none of that had appeared to register on his face because he hadn't come here to be received well. He'd come here to do a job. She thought about the woman next to him at the coffee table at lunch, laughing. She thought about a 7-year-old girl who sent her father heart emojis before a competition and told him to do his best. Victoria Sterling had built her company from a regional asset management firm with 14 employees into a billion-dollar consolidated holding enterprise with operations in 9 countries. And she had done it in large part by being very good at one thing that no business school had ever taught her. She could tell, within about 4 minutes of meeting someone, whether they were performing or whether they were real. Mason Hale was real. She was not entirely sure what that meant yet, but she was certain of it. Her phone buzzed. She looked at it. Unknown sender, same encrypted channel as before. This one was 2 words. It's time. She looked up at the main floor. The lights went out. But not all of them. Not all at once. It was more precise than that. The primary overhead banks cut first, dropping the main hall into the secondary lighting, which was dimmer and amber-toned and which changed the quality of the space immediately, transforming a well-lit professional environment into something that felt enclosed and directional. 4 seconds later, the emergency exit indicators above the main doors went from green to a cycling amber that meant the locks had received an override signal. Not locked. Not yet. But the signal was in the system. Mason heard it, felt it, actually, the way you feel a change in air pressure before you hear the weather, and he was already moving before the first person in the crowd started asking what was happening. The service entrance door opened, all the way this time. The first man through it was the one Mason had followed to the sublevel. Gray uniform, reversed badge, moving now without any pretense of casualness. He was followed by 2 more, and they were carrying the equipment cases, and they were moving with the specific geometry of people who had rehearsed this. On the main floor, the assessment exercise collapsed instantly into confused reality. Candidates who'd been running a simulation suddenly weren't. The crowd of observers, staff, evaluation personnel, the 24 non-candidate participants who'd been invited to watch the final round, started generating the particular noise of people who don't know whether something is part of a planned exercise or an actual emergency. That confusion was, Mason understood, part of the design. Confusion bought time. Confusion created cover. He moved toward the service entrance and then stopped, because there was a 4th person coming through the door. A woman, early 40s, the kind of composed that came from never having had to be otherwise, in a tailored jacket that said corporate more than tactical. She looked at the main floor like a person surveying something they owned, and she walked toward the center of the hall with the unhurried confidence of someone who knew exactly what was happening because she had arranged it. Mason didn't recognize her face, but the 3 men flanking her arranged themselves in a protective formation that told him everything he needed to know about what she was. She was the one in charge. He pivoted. The 3 candidates who'd been running the exercise near the center floor were beginning to realize this wasn't a simulation. 2 of them made the mistake of looking to the event coordinator for guidance. She had backed against the wall and was staring at her earpiece with the expression of someone receiving information that was colliding badly with other information she already had. One candidate, Torres, was already moving toward the service entrance with his hands open and his stance shifting. Mason caught Torres's arm. "Don't," he said. Torres looked at him. "What? Don't go toward the entrance. That's what they want. They need the floor clear in the center. He released the arm. Where's Calloway? Torres looked around. I don't... He was right. Calloway was gone. Mason filed that and moved on. He put his hand on Torres's shoulder, not controlling, just orienting. Get to the north wall. Take anyone near you with you. Stay there. He met Torres's eyes. Can you do that? Torres, to his credit, didn't argue. He looked at Mason for 1 second and then said, Yeah, and turned and started moving, pulling 2 candidates with him. Mason looked for Nadia. She was at the north corridor access, exactly where she'd said she'd be, and she was standing with her back to the wall and her phone out, and she caught his eye and held up 3 fingers. 3 personnel in the corridor. He held up 2 of his own. She raised an eyebrow. He pointed at the woman in the tailored jacket. Nadia's expression shifted. She understood. The woman's name was Carolyn Marsh, and Mason learned this 17 minutes later, but right now all he knew about her was what her body language communicated, which was considerable. She'd stopped in the center of the floor, and she was waiting. Not for the crowd to settle, not for anyone to approach her. She was waiting for a specific thing, and Mason couldn't see what it was yet. He thought, she's waiting for confirmation that Sterling is isolated. He looked up at the observation suite. The glass was dark, which meant either the lights had been cut up there too, or someone had darkened the glass deliberately. He couldn't see whether Victoria was still in the suite. He couldn't see Hargrove, the external team from the parking structure, if they'd gotten inside in time. He didn't know where they were. He had himself, Nadia on the north corridor, Torres and 2 others on the north wall, and the rest of the candidate pool in various states of confusion or response. He had a building with compromised exit locks, 3 visible tactical personnel from the service entrance, the woman in the center, and at least 3 more planted in the crowd who'd been running in place all morning. He also had, which he was only now fully processing, the fact that one of the remaining 8 candidates had disappeared. Calloway. He thought about Calloway's question at the table. Does she know what you used to do? The way he'd redirected toward Mason specifically. The way he'd been in the right position all day to observe candidate performance without being particularly visible himself. The way his resume, Calloway Protective Services, was a company name rather than a government or military designation. The kind of company that could be established in 2 weeks for the sole purpose of covering a legend. He was never competing, Mason thought. He was here to watch the room, which meant Calloway was not missing. Calloway had moved to a position. Mason did not know which position. He filed this as the most critical unknown and moved. He went toward the observation suite access stairwell, which was on the right side of the hall, behind the VIP seating buffer, and he did it by going along the wall rather than across the open floor, which kept him out of the central sightline of the woman in the tailored jacket and her 3 escorts. He was 2/3 of the way there when his phone buzzed. He didn't look at it. He kept moving. It buzzed again. He glanced. Mrs. Paola. He answered without stopping. You there? We're at Rosa's. Lily is fine. She's watching television, but Mason, there was a car. Mrs. Paola's voice had the quality of a woman who is managing herself carefully. On the street outside your building. It was there when we left, and then it was behind us on Meridian. Rosa's neighborhood is small. There aren't many. I might be imagining. What color? Black. A sedan. I couldn't see the plates. Did it follow you into Rosa's street? No, it turned off on Kavanaugh, but you did right to call me. Lock Rosa's door. Don't open it for anyone you don't know. I'll check in 30 minutes. He paused. Lily's okay? She's fine. She's eating crackers and watching something with a talking dog. Good. Lock the door. He hung up. He stood in the corridor outside the observation suite stairwell and felt the specific weight of being one person with 2 urgent problems in 2 different locations, and he understood, with the clarity that only actual high-pressure experience produces, not training, not simulation, that the plan to use Lily against him was already active. They weren't going to grab her. They were going to make him think they were going to grab her. They were going to make him leave. If he left, Victoria was unprotected. If he stayed, he didn't know what was happening to his daughter. He thought about the phone call in the sub-level. Use the kid if you have to. He won't leave her. He thought, they're right, and they know they're right, and knowing they're right is what they're counting on. He thought about Lily eating crackers and watching something with a talking dog 12 miles away in a locked house on a small street where the black sedan had already turned off. He thought, they're not going to touch her. Not yet. That's the leverage. You can't spend leverage by using it. He went up the stairs. The observation suite door was unlocked, which was wrong. Mason pushed it open from the side rather than walking through it directly, and the room beyond was dim. The main lights cut, same as below, but not empty. Victoria Sterling was standing in the far corner of the room, next to the window that overlooked the main hall. Hargrove was beside her, and he was holding his left arm in a way that meant something had happened to it. A third person, one of the external team Mason didn't recognize, was positioned near the door that led to the secondary corridor. And Derek Calloway was standing between Victoria and the window with a small device in his hand and the expression of a man who had arrived at the place he'd been moving toward all day. Nobody was talking. Mason had apparently walked into the pause between something that had just happened and something that was about to. Calloway looked at him. Mason looked at Calloway. "Close the door," Calloway said. Mason didn't close the door. "I'll ask once more." "You won't," Mason said, "because what you need right now is quiet, and a door slamming doesn't help you." He stepped into the room and let the door drift most of the way closed behind him, and he kept his eyes on the device in Calloway's hand. "What is that?" "Communication kill switch for the building's internal security network." Calloway's voice was even, professional. The voice of someone running a plan, not improvising. "If I activate it, the event security goes dark. All of it. Cameras, communication, access control. The teams downstairs have approximately a 4-minute window." "To do what?" "To remove Ms. Sterling from the premises without a verifiable record." Mason looked at Victoria. She was looking back at him with the expression of a person who had been in a dangerous situation for several minutes and had not yet found a way out of it, but who had not stopped looking for one either. Her jaw was set. She was not panicking. She was thinking. Hargrove shifted slightly and made a sound that indicated his arm was more than just uncomfortable. "You broke his arm," Mason said. Calloway didn't confirm or deny it. "I need you to move to the left side of the room," he said. "No." Another pause. This one different. Calloway reassessing, running a recalculation. He'd expected compliance or aggression. He hadn't expected flat negation delivered at a conversational volume. "You don't have a weapon," Calloway said. "Neither do you. That's a communication device, not a weapon, which means your leverage is the threat of what happens downstairs, not what you can do up here. That's still considerable leverage." "It is," Mason agreed. "But you're also not going to activate it right now, because activating it starts a 4-minute clock, and right now you don't have control of the floor below, which means your teams down there are working against a partial timeline, and you need more setup before you can afford a countdown." Calloway studied him. "You're guessing." "I'm not," Mason said. "Your woman in the tailored jacket, Marsh, I'm assuming. She was waiting when I came up here. Still waiting. She needed confirmation that this room was secured before she moved. You haven't given her that confirmation, which means the 4-minute clock hasn't started. Which means if I can keep you talking for approximately 3 more minutes, Hargrove's external team will be on the main floor." Something moved in Calloway's expression. It was small, and it was fast, and Mason almost missed it. But he didn't miss it. "They're already down there," Mason said, changing his assessment in real time. "Your people found them." Calloway said nothing. "How many did you pull out?" Calloway said nothing. Victoria said very quietly from the corner, 2. "They took 2 of Hargrove's people in the corridor outside. That's how he got his arm broken." Mason filed that. 2 down, which meant the external team was running at reduced capacity. He didn't know the total number, didn't know the remaining capability. He looked at the device in Calloway's hand. Then he looked at Calloway's face, and he did the thing he'd spent years learning to do. Not read the surface, read the structure underneath. The microtensions. The places where the plan and the reality had started to diverge, and what that divergence was doing to the person holding the plan. Calloway was good. He was controlled and professional, and he had clearly done things like this before, or things adjacent to this. And he believed in what he was executing because people who run operations like this have to believe in them, or they can't sustain the internal pressure. But Calloway was also here in this room personally, which was not what a mission lead does when the operation is running cleanly. A clean operation means you're on the floor below watching the pieces move. You're in this room because something went wrong. And the something that went wrong was Mason flagging Hargrove 45 minutes ago. And the adjustment to that development had put Calloway here personally to manage the principal directly, which meant Calloway was running a contingency, not a plan. Contingencies were improvised. Improvised things had gaps. Mason thought about where the gap was. He thought about the fact that Calloway, for all his composure, kept his right thumb on the activation point of the device rather than keeping his grip neutral. He was ready to press it. He was one moment away from pressing it, which meant he was closer to the edge of his own confidence than he was showing. "You have maybe 90 seconds before you have to make a decision," Mason said, keeping his voice conversational, not aggressive, not conciliatory, just level. "Whatever you are going to do with that device, it either works now or it doesn't work at all, because the window is closing." He took one step toward the center of the room. Calloway tracked him, but didn't move. "What happens to you if the operation fails?" Calloway looked at him. "That's not a rhetorical question," Mason said. "I'm asking because whoever contracted this built themselves a long distance from the execution. If it goes wrong, the people who go down are the ones on the floor. You know that. The operation isn't failing. It's not succeeding either. Your team in the sub-level was compromised. Your planted personnel on the main floor. I made 3 of them before noon. The surveillance repositioning on exit camera 1 was noted on arrival." He watched Calloway's face. "You've been running a plan built on the assumption that this evaluation was selecting candidates who wouldn't know what they were looking at. That assumption was wrong from this morning." Calloway was quiet. Victoria, still in the corner, still with her jaw set, said, "How many board members did they get to?" Calloway looked at her. Something shifted again. Not the composure, but the arrangement underneath it. 3, Victoria said, reading him the same way Mason had been reading him. "Was it 3? Because if it was 3, you needed my signature on one specific document before Thursday, and you needed it to appear coerced, which means you needed me in an environment you controlled. That's what this was." She looked at Mason. "They needed a coercion scenario with documentation. Video, ideally. Attack on the CEO at her own event, CEO under duress, signature obtained." She looked back at Calloway. "Is that right?" Calloway didn't answer. "I'm going to take that as a yes," she said. Mason was watching Calloway's thumb on the device. "It's not going to work," Victoria said, and her voice had gone to a different place. Not angry, not afraid, but the particular steady quality of someone who has spent 10 years making decisions under pressure and has found that calmness is more effective than anything else. "Even if you activate it, even if your teams get me out of this building, the signature under duress is contestable, and it requires authentication, and every authentication system I have is biometric and can't be replicated by a coerced document. Your board majority collapses without a valid transfer mechanism." She paused. "I think you know that. I think whoever contracted this oversold the deliverable." Calloway's thumb moved. Mason moved. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't the kind of thing that looked like anything if you weren't close enough to see it clearly. He covered the distance between himself and Calloway in less than 2 seconds, and he didn't go for the device. Going for the device was what Calloway's hand was prepared for, and Calloway had a full second of reaction time if Mason telegraphed toward the hand. Instead, he went for the arm, the elbow joint specifically, the same physics he'd used that morning with Varric, redirect the structure rather than fight the muscle. And the angle of Calloway's arm changed in a way that the thumb couldn't compensate for, and the device went sideways and hit the window ledge, and Mason caught it before it hit the floor. Calloway recovered fast. He was good, genuinely good. And the counter that came was fast and technically sound, and it connected with Mason's ribs on the left side with enough force to make him exhale sharply. But Mason didn't have the device anymore. Calloway looked at the window ledge, then at Mason. "Give it back," Calloway said. His voice had fractured just slightly, just the edge of it. "No," Mason said, and his ribs ached, and he stood up straight anyway. For 4 seconds, nobody moved. Then Hargrove, with his broken arm and his back against the wall, said very calmly into the secondary phone he'd somehow kept hold of throughout all of this, "Execute." What happened next happened across 3 locations simultaneously, which Mason only fully understood in the reconstruction afterward. On the main floor, the 5 members of Hargrove's external team who'd entered through the East Corridor access, not the compromised parking structure route, but a secondary access that Hargrove had activated on Victoria's instruction, the quietly she'd specified, moved on Carolyn Marsh and her escorts in a coordinated sequence that Nadia, holding the North Corridor, was able to support because she'd tracked every one of Marsh's personnel for the last 22 minutes and knew their positions better than they knew each other's. In the sublevel, building maintenance security, contacted directly by a backup channel that the operations communication disruption plan had not accounted for because nobody had told the building's own maintenance contractor that the event security had been compromised, restored access to the junction corridor, and found the communication staging equipment exactly where Mason had said it was. In the observation suite, the external team member who'd been positioned near the door, who had been waiting for Hargrove's signal while nursing what appeared to be a significant bruise across the right side of his face from whatever had happened before Mason arrived, stepped forward and assisted Mason in removing Calloway from the equation in a way that was efficient, if not graceful. It took 11 minutes. 11 minutes is not a long time in most contexts. In this context, it felt very long. When it was over, Mason was standing in the observation suite with Calloway zip-tied to a chair that had been pulled from the conference table, the communication device in his jacket pocket, and the particular feeling he always had after this kind of thing. Not elation, not relief, just the lowered pressure of a situation that had moved from active to resolved, like a headache going away. You don't feel good, you just feel less bad. He looked at his ribs. They were going to bruise, but nothing had cracked. He'd had cracked ribs before, and these weren't that. Victoria Sterling was standing 4 feet away. She was looking at him. "Are you all right?" she said. "I'm fine." He looked at Hargrove, who was sitting down now. "He needs a hospital for the arm." "I've already called for it," Hargrove said, with the dignity of a man determined not to acknowledge that his arm was at an angle it hadn't been at that morning. Victoria was still looking at Mason. "You knew about the board," he said. "I suspected about the board. I've suspected for 3 weeks. The encrypted message confirmed it." She paused. "Did you send it?" He shook his head. "No." "Do you know who did?" He thought about that. "Someone inside your organization who knew what was planned and wanted it stopped without being directly involved in stopping it." He paused. "Someone with access to authentication codes who also knew enough about the operation to provide specific intelligence." Victoria's eyes moved slightly, a thought happening behind them. "You have an idea," he said. "Maybe." She looked at the window, down at the main floor below. "Maybe." She was quiet for a moment. "The candidate file. You didn't submit your own name." "No." "And your resume? The gaps?" "Yes." "Will you tell me about them?" He looked at her for a long moment. It was a question he almost never answered, and when he did, he answered it in the shortest possible terms and moved on. He thought about whether this was a situation where the short version was sufficient. He said, "I spent 8 years in a federal covert tactical unit. Not a unit that appears in any public record. Not something I can verify through normal channels, and not something I'd try to verify, because the people I worked with are still working, and I don't discuss it." He met her eyes. "I left when my daughter was born. Her mother, we didn't stay together. She left when Lily was 3 months old, and I decided to get out rather than put Lily through a childhood of absent parents and no information." He paused. "That's the version I tell. It's accurate, just not complete." Victoria held his gaze. "What's incomplete about it?" He thought for a moment. "It wasn't just a decision," he said. "It was the only thing that made sense. When you're holding something that small and that dependent, you can't be the person who was. Not entirely. You become something else." He stopped. "That's probably not relevant." "It's relevant," she said quietly. Calloway, from the chair, said nothing. He was looking at the floor with the expression of a man recalculating very many things. Below them, on the main floor, Mason could see Nadia organizing the candidates into a coherent group near the north wall, speaking to Torres, pointing at exits, managing the room with the competence of someone who'd done crisis management in real environments. The lights had come back to full. Someone had restored the primary power when the sub-level team secured the junction corridor. The main floor looked almost ordinary again, except for the people being restrained near the service entrance, and the woman in the tailored jacket sitting on the padded floor of the combat assessment area, with her hands behind her back and the careful, flat expression of someone who was already mentally preparing for a different kind of conversation. Mason's phone buzzed. "Mrs. Paola, we're fine." Lily fell asleep. Rosa made dinner. He closed his eyes for 1 second. Just one. When he opened them, Victoria was still looking at him, and she said something that surprised him. "What's her name?" "My daughter?" "Yes." "Lily," he said. Victoria nodded. She looked back at the window. Below, Hargrove's external team was methodically working the floor, and the situation was contained, and the plan that had been designed to remove a billionaire CEO from the building in a 4-minute window had failed, and the people who'd built it were on their way to somewhere else entirely. "Lily," Victoria repeated, like she was placing the name somewhere specific. Then she said, "We have a lot to talk about, Mr. Hale." Mason looked at his bruised ribs, his wrinkled suit, the cold travel mug he'd left downstairs under a folding chair that morning. "Yeah," he said, "we do." Neither of them said anything for a moment, and the building settled around them. And somewhere below, Nadia was talking to a situation coordinator in the clipped, organized tone of a person who knew how to end something. Mason thought about Lily, asleep on Rosa's couch with her fever coming down, and Charlotte's web on the armrest beside her. He thought, one day, just show up. Whatever happens, happens. He hadn't expected this to be what happened, but here he was. The next 2 hours were the kind of hours that didn't feel like hours. They felt like a single long moment, stretched and compressed in uneven ways. The way time works when adrenaline is leaving your system, but the situation hasn't fully resolved yet, and your body hasn't gotten the message that it can stand down. Mason knew the feeling. He'd lived in it often enough to understand that the crash came later, that right now he was still running on the last of whatever had kept him functional since 2:15 in the morning, and that the crash, when it arrived, was going to be significant. He didn't think about the crash. He thought about the floor below. The Harwick Convention Center's main hall had been reorganized in the 50 minutes following Hargrove's execute command into something that looked, depending on where you were standing, either like the aftermath of a controlled operation or the aftermath of a genuine emergency. Both descriptions were accurate. The remaining candidates, the ones who hadn't been part of the operation, which was most of them, were grouped near the north wall under what Nadia had organized into a coherent holding pattern, speaking to a rotating sequence of Hargrove's people and 2 individuals Mason didn't recognize who had arrived with the kind of quiet authority that suggested law enforcement or something adjacent to it. Carolyn Marsh and her 3 escorts were no longer on the main floor. They'd been moved to a secured conference room on the building's 2nd level by 4 of Hargrove's external team, and Mason had not been in the room when that happened, but he'd watched it from the corridor window, and he'd noted that Marsh had walked without being physically assisted and without speaking, which told him she was already in the mental posture of someone who had lawyers and intended to use them. Calloway was still in the observation suite, still in the chair, now with 2 people watching him who had credentials that Mason couldn't see clearly, but that Hargrove had apparently found satisfactory. The sublevel had been fully secured. The communication staging equipment had been photographed and cataloged by someone who arrived with a proper case and gloves, and the methodical energy of a person who did this professionally. The man with the reversed badge, whose actual name Mason learned from a brief exchange with one of the law-adjacent individuals, was Grigor Fetch, which sounded made up but apparently wasn't, had been found in the sublevel corridor, apparently unable to decide between waiting to be found and attempting to exit through a service shaft that turned out to be a better idea in theory than execution. The building's exit locks had been restored to standard function at 4:34 p.m. The repositioned camera above exit 1 had been noted, preserved in its modified position for documentation, and placed under supplementary recording. All of this was happening around Mason in organized professional sequence, and he was aware of it the way you're aware of traffic when you're walking on a sidewalk. Present, registered, not requiring his direct participation. What was requiring his direct participation was Victoria. They were in a side room on the second floor, the kind of room that had a long table and chairs and a screen on the far wall and no windows. And Victoria was sitting at the head of the table with a legal pad that she'd found somewhere and a pen that she was holding but not writing with. And Mason was sitting 4 chairs down from her because that was where he'd sat when he came in, and he hadn't thought to reconsider it. And between them was a paper cup of water and a half-eaten sleeve of crackers that someone had brought in at some point. Hargrove was not in the room. Hargrove was at the hospital, which Victoria had been very clear about and which Hargrove had argued against until she'd said, "Hargrove, I am telling you for the last time to get your arm looked at before you make any other decisions," in a tone that closed the argument. The two of them were alone. "The board meeting is Thursday," Victoria said. She wasn't looking at the legal pad. She was looking at the middle distance, the way people look when they're organizing something large in their heads and need the visual field to be quiet while they do it. The motion that's been circulated, it's a no-confidence resolution, which requires a majority plus 1 to advance. I have 4 board members I'm certain of. I have 3 I'm not. She paused. Those 3 are the ones the message indicated were compromised. Do you know how? Financially, probably. Pendleton has debt exposure he hasn't disclosed publicly. Morrison was passed over for a committee chair last cycle, and I suspect he's been nursing it. Chow. She stopped. Chow, I'm less sure about. She might have been pressured rather than bought. There's a difference. Mason thought about this. Who had access to Pendleton's private financials? Victoria looked at him. People inside the company. Senior operations, legal, finance. Which is also who had access to the event infrastructure, personnel files, the candidate background checks. He turned the water cup in his hands. The encrypted message came from inside the company. Someone who knew the authentication codes, knew the operation, and wanted it stopped. Yes. Who is that? Victoria set her pen down. I have a thought, she said, but I'm not certain enough to say it out loud yet. I need to see the authentication trace from the message before I say a name. He accepted that. It was a reasonable position, and she had the right to hold it. The 3 executives named in the message, he said. Did you recognize them? Yes. Her voice was flat and careful. 2 I hired personally. He didn't say anything to that because there wasn't anything useful to say. He'd seen that expression before, not often, but enough. On people who discovered that the loyalty they'd extended had been returned in a specific and damaging way, and the experience of that discovery was something that required processing, not comment. After a moment, Victoria said, You saw the camera this morning? Yes. When you arrived? Yes. And you said nothing. I didn't know yet if it was significant. 1 camera 3 degrees off axis is maintenance or vibration or a dozen other things. He paused. By mid-morning, I had enough additional indicators that it was significant. And you flagged Hargrove. At the earliest point, I could do it without tipping whoever was listening. She looked at him for a moment. Where did you learn to assess environments that way? The camera, the badge orientation, the hand position? Practice, he said. For how long? He thought about the honest answer. Since I was 23, he said, which means 9 years of formal training and application, and then 7 more years of doing it informally because it doesn't turn off. Informal meaning I do it in grocery stores, in parking lots, at Lily's school when I pick her up. He paused. She thinks it's funny. She started pointing things out to me when she was 5. She'd say, Dad, that man's tie is crooked and he keeps touching it. He stopped. He hadn't meant to say that. Victoria was watching him with an expression that was different from how she'd been watching him all day. More direct, less executive. How long have you been doing it alone, she said. With her, since she was 3 months old. That's 7 years, he said. Yeah. A silence. Not uncomfortable, exactly. The kind of silence that happened between people who were both tired and both processing things larger than the room they were in. My father ran a company, Victoria said, and the non sequitur surprised him enough that he looked up. Not Sterling Consolidated. He had a smaller firm, regional, but he ran it the way certain men of his generation ran things, which is to say, alone. No partners he trusted, no advisors he fully listened to, no colleagues he considered equals. She looked at the legal pad. He worked himself to death at 61. Literally, heart failure in his office at 7 p.m. on a Tuesday. His assistant found him the next morning. She paused. I used to think the lesson was, don't build a company the way he did. Delegate, trust people, build systems. A short exhale. Turns out the lesson is more nuanced, because he also built something real, and some of the people he didn't trust were absolutely untrustworthy. Mason looked at her. You're not sure which mistake you made. I'm sure I made one. She picked up the pen again. I'm not sure if I trusted too much or too little. Probably both, Mason said, in different directions. She looked at him and almost smiled. It wasn't quite a smile, but it was in the territory. Probably, she said. His phone buzzed. He looked at it. Mrs. Paula. Lily asking where you are. What should I tell her? He typed back, tell her I'm finishing work. Tell her I'll explain when I get there. Tell her the crackers are a good idea. 3 seconds later, she says okay. She also says you owe her a chapter. He put the phone down. Your daughter? Victoria said. She's been at my neighbor's all day. He paused. They sent a car to my building. I got her out before the competition started. Victoria was very still. They were going to use her. They were going to make me think they were going to use her. The actual leverage is the threat, not the action. You spend the threat by acting on it. He said it matter-of-factly, which was the only way he could say it, because the other way, the way where he thought too specifically about what it meant to have his daughter used as a variable in someone else's calculation, that way led somewhere he couldn't go and still function. She's fine. She's eating crackers and watching television. Victoria looked at him. Does it work? Compartmentalizing it like that? No, he said, but you do it anyway. Hargrove returned from the hospital at 7:43 with a cast on his left forearm and the expression of a man who had been told to rest and had no intention of doing so. He had also, apparently, made approximately 11 phone calls from the car on the way back because he arrived with information. He came into the side room without knocking, which was his standard operating mode, and he set a tablet on the table in front of Victoria and said, Authentication trace is done. Victoria looked at the tablet. Her expression changed in a way that was hard to read quickly. Not shock, not exactly, because Mason's sense was that she had already been moving toward this conclusion. More like confirmation landing, the particular weight of a thing you suspected becoming a thing you knew. She looked up at Hargrove. It's Elaine. Hargrove nodded. Elaine Marsh, Victoria said, and then looked at Mason. Carolyn Marsh is her older sister. Mason absorbed this. The woman in the tailored jacket on the main floor. The woman who had organized the operation and walked into the arena with the confidence of someone who knew exactly what she'd arranged. The older sister of Elaine Marsh, who was, Mason inferred from the weight in Victoria's voice, someone inside Sterling Consolidated. Someone close. How close? He said. Senior Vice President of Strategic Operations, Victoria said. She's been with the company for 6 years. She had access to everything. Authentication codes, personnel files, board communications, event logistics. She set the tablet down. She built the operation from the inside using her sister as the external executor. Does Carolyn know about Elaine? They're sisters, Victoria said. Carolyn knew. Does Carolyn know that Elaine sent the message that stopped the operation? The room went quiet. Hargrove said slowly, That's a significant question. Because if Carolyn knows, then whatever Elaine's reason was for sending the message, loyalty, guilt, a separate calculation, Carolyn is going to know her operation was undermined from inside her own infrastructure. Mason looked at Victoria. Which changes Carolyn's posture in whatever conversation she's about to have with law enforcement. Victoria looked at Hargrove. Hargrove looked at his cast and seemed to make a decision. I'll make a call, he said, and went back out the door. Victoria sat with what had just been said for a moment. Then she looked at Mason and said, Why did she do it? Elaine. I don't know. What would you guess? He thought about it. He thought about the encryption on the message, the specificity of it, the intelligence it contained, the authentication that proved it was internal. He thought about someone building a plan with their sister, and then, at the last possible moment, sending a warning to the target. I'd guess, he said, that she was in until she wasn't, that somewhere in the construction of it, something changed. Either what she thought the goal was turned out to be something else, or someone got hurt that wasn't supposed to, or she looked at what was actually being done, not what she'd been told was being done, and couldn't continue. He paused. People build rationalizations for things. The rationalizations hold until they meet the actual reality of the thing. Victoria was quiet. You sound like you have some experience with that. Everyone does, he said. Just different situations. She looked at him for a long moment. What was yours? He hadn't expected the question. He sat with it for a second, deciding. There was an operation, he said. 3rd year. We were running a network extraction in a place I can't name, and there was a secondary objective that I was told was time-sensitive and critical. I executed it. Afterward, I learned what the secondary objective had actually been protecting. He stopped. It didn't match what I'd been told it was. The people who made the call were 3 levels above me and had information I didn't, and there's a version of the story where that means the decision was correct at a level I couldn't see. He looked at the table. But there's another version where it just means I was useful and uninformed, which are the 2 qualities that make you most valuable to certain operations. Which version do you believe? I believe both versions are true simultaneously, he said, which is why I got out. Victoria was very still. I'm not making a comparison, he added. Your situation is different. I know, she said. I was just thinking that... She stopped. Started again. I was thinking that there are a lot of people who spend their whole careers being useful and uninformed and never figure out the second part. She looked at the window, which was blank. Interior wall. Elaine knew. That's what the message was. It was her figuring out the second part. Maybe, he said, but it doesn't excuse the rest of it. No, he said. It doesn't. At 9 o'clock, the main floor had been cleared and documented, and the law enforcement presence, 3 individuals from a federal financial crimes division and 2 from a state investigations unit, which told Mason something about how Victoria had characterized the situation in her calls during the last 3 hours, had begun their preliminary intake process with the detained personnel. Mason was not part of that process. He sat in the corridor outside the side room and ate the rest of the crackers from the sleeve and called Mrs. Paula. We're fine, Mrs. Paula said before he could ask. She's in Rosa's guest room. She went down about an hour ago. Temperature is normal. A pause. She was asking about you. What did she ask? She asked if you were good at your job. Mrs. Paula's voice had a small smile in it. I told her yes. She said she knew, but she wanted to hear someone else say it. Mason looked at the corridor wall. The fluorescent lighting in this part of the building was cooler than the main hall, and it made everything look slightly institutional. Thank you, he said. For today. For all of it. You've thanked me enough over the years, Mrs. Paula said. Go finish what you're doing. She'll be here when you're done. He hung up. He sat with the empty cracker sleeve for a moment and then put it in a nearby trash bin and stood up and looked at the door to the side room and thought about what was waiting on the other side of the next few hours. Nadia appeared at the end of the corridor. She walked toward him with the particular gait of someone who had been on her feet for 15 hours and had made the decision to remain functional through sheer professional will. She stopped in front of him and looked at his left side. Your ribs, she said. I'm fine. You're holding your left arm at an angle. I'm fine. Mason. 2 or 3 will bruise. Nothing cracked. He looked at her. The north corridor. Shh. You held it. 3 of them, she said. 2 I clocked from the afternoon sessions. 3rd came in through a maintenance access I hadn't flagged. She said it the way he'd said things about his own performance all day. Without drama, just accuracy. He got past me initially. I caught him at the secondary junction. You were alone. For about 4 minutes. She shrugged, which was not a casual shrug. It was the shrug of someone who had done difficult things in insufficient company before. Torres helped. When you redirected him to the north wall, he ended up 15 feet from the corridor access. He's not trained for this specific situation, but he's not useless. He's good, Mason said. He just doesn't know which things to care about yet. Nadia looked at him. Are you staying? Tonight? In this situation. With her. She nodded toward the side room door. You've been running her operation for the last 4 hours. Everyone in there is looking to you for assessment. I don't think you've noticed that. He thought about it. He'd noticed some of it. He hadn't thought about what it meant. She's going to offer you something, Nadia said. I don't know what, but she's been watching you all day like someone who found a thing they didn't know they were looking for. She runs a security recruitment process every year, he said. That's what today is. Today is not what any previous year of this has been, Nadia said. And you know that. He didn't answer. Nadia looked at the door, then at him. What I'm asking is whether you want to be here. Not whether the money's right or whether the position makes sense. Whether you want to be here. He thought about the cracker sleeve in the trash bin. He thought about his apartment and the refrigerator that made a sound now. He thought about Lily's school calendar and the medical bills and the heat. He thought about the camera that had been 3 degrees off axis. He thought about the specific quality of focus that had lived in him all day. The alertness, the assessment, the way the whole thing had unfolded in a sequence that he'd tracked and anticipated and managed, and how it had been the most present he'd felt in 4 years. Not happy, exactly. Present. Like the part of him that had been running at 20% capacity since he left his former life had briefly been permitted to run at something closer to its actual capacity. I don't know yet, he said. Nadia nodded. Fair. She straightened slightly. For what it's worth, and I know you didn't ask, you should know. Whatever you decided to do next, today wasn't nothing. She walked away down the corridor. The problem with the night was that it didn't end cleanly. Mason had expected, or not expected, but unconsciously assumed, that there would be a point at which the situation resolved into something with a clear boundary. Finished. Done. Go home. The way operations resolved when he was 26 and the debrief happened and the team dispersed and you went back to whatever you had that counted as normal. But Sterling Consolidated wasn't a covert unit, and this wasn't an operation with a clear command structure and a designated debrief protocol. It was a corporation in the middle of a crisis with multiple moving pieces and a board meeting on Thursday and a federal financial crimes intake happening on the floor below, and a CEO who had been on the phone for the better part of 2 hours making calls that Mason could hear the edges of through the side room door. Careful, controlled, strategic calls that she was making in sequence, like moves in a game she was simultaneously learning the new rules of while playing. He stayed because there wasn't a clean moment to leave. And he stayed because Hargrove kept asking him assessment questions that needed answering. And he stayed because somewhere around 10 p.m., one of the federal investigators came to the side room and said they needed someone to walk them through the physical layout of the building's security compromise. And Victoria had said, without looking up from her phone call, "Ask Mr. Hale." So he walked the investigator through it. The camera, the access log timestamp, the reversed badge, the sublevel staging, the position personnel on the main floor, the observation suite access, Calloway's role. The investigator, a woman named Farrar, who took notes by hand in a notebook that she'd apparently carried in a jacket pocket all day, listened without interrupting and wrote things down in a compressed shorthand that Mason couldn't read over her shoulder. At the end, she said, "You identified all of this during the competition?" "Yes." "While participating in the competition?" "Yes." She looked at him. "What's your background?" "Federal," he said. "I'm not able to be more specific." She looked at him for 2 more seconds, then wrote something in the notebook. "Okay," she said, with the tone of someone who understood what federal "I'm not able to be more specific" meant and was making a note of it for later. He went back to the corridor. At 11:15, Victoria came out of the side room. She looked, for the first time all day, genuinely tired. Not the performed tiredness of someone who was managing their image while exhausted. Actual tired, the way it settled around the eyes, the slight difference in posture, the way she stood in the corridor and didn't immediately move anywhere but just stood there for a moment. She looked at him. Elaine turned herself in, she said. 2 hours ago. She went to the federal building downtown and walked in and asked for a financial crimes investigator. A pause. She brought documentation, her own records of the operation, communications, financial transfers, everything. Another pause. She said she wasn't going to let Carolyn take the full weight of it. Mason thought about that. The woman in the tailored jacket who had walked into the main hall with the confidence of someone executing a plan. Walking into that hall because her sister had built her the access from the inside. That's why she sent the message, he said. She was already decided. She wasn't going to stop the operation and then disappear. She was going to stop it and then document it and then take responsibility. Yes, Victoria said. That's what I think. That's... He stopped. Complicated, Victoria said. Yeah. They stood in the corridor and neither of them said anything for a moment. The board meeting will proceed on Thursday, Victoria said. With the documentation Elaine brought in and what our own records show, the no-confidence motion collapses. Pendleton's financial exposure will be reported to the appropriate oversight body. Morrison and Chow... She stopped. Chow cooperated. She came to me voluntarily this evening before she knew about Elaine. She said she'd been pressured with something she didn't want disclosed. Victoria looked at the wall. I told her we'd address that separately. That wasn't tonight's problem. You made that call in about 20 minutes. I made it in about 4 minutes. I spent 16 minutes making sure I wasn't making it wrong. She looked at him. I make fast decisions. I always have. Most of the time that's useful. Sometimes it's not. I'm still figuring out which is which. Everyone is. Not everyone runs a billion-dollar holding company while doing it. No, he said. Fair point. She turned to face him more directly. She was still holding her phone, the way people hold their phones when they've been using them intensively all evening. Not checking it, just carrying it as an extension of everything they'd been managing. I need to ask you something, she said. He waited. The competition today. The legitimate part of it. She looked at him steadily. Based on your performance, on what I saw and what the assessors recorded, you would have placed first, by a significant margin. She paused. That wasn't the outcome because the competition was compromised before the final assessment completed. But I want you to know what the outcome would have been. He looked at her. Okay. I'm not telling you that to flatter you. I'm telling you because what I'm about to ask isn't charity. What are you about to ask? She took a breath. I want to offer you a position, not the position the competition was selecting for. That was a mid-tier protective detail role. I mean, a senior position, head of personal security and strategic protection. It would mean rebuilding my protection infrastructure from scratch, which is necessary anyway given what happened today. She paused. It would mean irregular hours, some travel, proximity to high-pressure situations. It would also mean a salary that is considerably different from whatever you're working with currently, and stability, and the resources to do the job properly. She stopped. Mason didn't say anything. I'm also aware, Victoria said, with the particular care of someone stepping into territory they weren't certain of, that you have a daughter, and that a job like this, structured in the way I'm describing, would need to accommodate that. I'm not asking you to be available in ways that aren't compatible with your family. He looked at her. You're amending the terms before I've responded. I'm clarifying them. Why? She held his gaze. Because the most useful person I've met today, in a day that included a federal intake process, 3 board-level crisis calls, and an active assault on my company, showed up in a wrinkled suit carrying a cold cup of coffee after spending the night with a sick child. She paused. I'm not interested in a version of this arrangement that doesn't work for both of us. Mason looked at the corridor floor. He looked at his hands. He thought about 9 years of formal training and 7 years of informal application, and the refrigerator that made a sound, and the heat bill and the medical bills, and Mrs. Paola's face when he asked her to take Lily somewhere without explaining why, and the way Mrs. Paola had done it anyway because she'd learned over 4 years what asking without explaining meant. He thought about Lily at 5 years old, pointing at a man in a grocery store and saying, Dad, that man's tie is crooked and he keeps touching it. He thought about Nadia in the corridor. Today wasn't nothing. He thought about the camera, 3 degrees off axis. I need to think about it, he said. Victoria nodded immediately. Not disappointment, something closer to respect. Of course. I'm not saying no. I know. I need to talk to. He stopped. He'd been about to say talk to someone, which was what he'd say if there were someone to talk to. There wasn't. He hadn't had that in 7 years. I need to think about it, he said again. Take whatever time you need. She paused. Within reason, I have a board meeting Thursday. He almost smiled. I noticed you added that. I'm not completely without self-interest. No, he said. Neither am I. They stood in the corridor a moment longer, and then Victoria said she needed to make one more call, and she went back into the side room, and Mason stood in the corridor and thought about all of it, and thought about nothing in particular, and eventually went to find his travel mug where he'd left it under the folding chair on the main floor, because it was a good travel mug and Lily had given it to him for his birthday with the drawing of a coffee cup on the side in red marker that had mostly faded now, mostly but not entirely. The main floor was quieter. The fold-up chairs had been stacked. The padded combat assessment square was still in the center, slightly scuffed from the day. The camera above exit 1 was still in its modified position, pointing down at the door. Mason found his travel mug under his chair, exactly where he'd left it that morning, 11 hours ago. He straightened up and looked at the floor. The room felt enormous and empty in a way it hadn't felt that morning when it was full of people performing confidence at each other. Now it was just a room. High ceilings, scuff marks, the ambient hum of a building settling into the evening. He thought about walking into this room at 6 in the morning with cold coffee and a wrinkled suit and the absolute absence of expectation. Not pessimism, not false modesty, just the genuine state of a person who had been awake since 2:15 and who had learned through long practice not to require outcomes, just to show up. He thought about Varric on the ground at 28 seconds, the way the room had gone quiet. He thought about Calloway's thumb on the device, the ribs that were going to make tomorrow morning interesting. He thought about Victoria Sterling setting her water glass down and saying, "Who is that?" He looked at the camera above the exit and thought, they repositioned you to eliminate the record. They needed you not to see what they were doing. They needed something they could control to be blind. He thought, that's the thing about blind spots. The dangerous ones are the ones you arranged yourself. He turned off the main floor lights on his way out. The switch was by the east door, he'd clocked it that morning, and went into the lobby and out through the front entrance into the night air. It was cool. The city was doing what cities did at midnight, thinned out, reduced, operating at a frequency that was different from the day, not quieter exactly, but more honest somehow, less performance. He stood on the sidewalk outside the Harwick Convention Center and breathed for a minute. His left side ached. His feet ached. His eyes were doing the specific thing that happened when he'd been awake for 22 hours and looking at things carefully for most of them. He called Mrs. Paula. She picked up on the second ring, which meant she'd been awake. "I'm on my way," he said. "I'll be there in 20 minutes. "She's asleep," Mrs. Paula said. "I know. I just want to—" "I know," she said. 20 minutes. He walked to his car. He sat in the driver's seat for a moment before starting it and looked at the building through the windshield, the glass and steel structure that had caught the morning light and thrown it back in his face, 6 a.m., 11 hours, and a considerable amount of consequential events ago. He thought about tomorrow. He thought about Thursday. He started the car. The city moved past him on the drive to Rose's neighborhood, and he didn't analyze it or assess it. He just watched it go by the way you watch things, when the operational part of your brain has finally started to power down, and you're just a person in a car at midnight going to check on your daughter. His phone buzzed once. He didn't check it until he was stopped at a light. Unknown sender. "You did well today. E." He looked at it for a long moment, then the light changed and he drove. He parked on Rose's street and sat for a moment, looking at the dark windows of the house. The black sedan hadn't returned. The street was quiet and residential and ordinary in the way that streets were ordinary when nothing was happening on them, which he never completely took for granted. He got out. Rosa answered the door before he knocked, which meant she'd been watching for him. She was a small woman in her 60s with Mrs. Paula's eyes and a different relationship to silence. Where Mrs. Paula filled quiet with gentle talk, Rosa was comfortable in it. She looked at him once, top to bottom, the way women of her generation looked at people who had clearly been through something and weren't saying so. "She's in the guest room," Rosa said. "She woke up an hour ago and asked if you were coming." I said yes. "Is she asleep now?" "She was trying not to be." Rosa stood aside to let him in. The guest room was at the end of a short hallway. The door was half open. The nightlight on the baseboard cast a low, warm light. Lily was in the bed with her eyes closed, but the particular too-still quality of her breathing told him she was awake. She was 7 years old and not very good at pretending to sleep when she wanted to be awake, which was something she'd never needed to practice because he came home when he said he would. He sat on the edge of the bed. Her eyes opened. "Hi," she said. "Hi, Bug." She looked at him the way she'd been looking at him since she was old enough to look at things, with a directness that some children had and some didn't, the kind that didn't perform and didn't hedge. She looked at his face and then at his left side, where his arm was still angled slightly wrong. "You got hurt," she said. "A little bit." "Does it hurt?" "A little bit." She thought about this with the seriousness she applied to information she was deciding what to do with. Then she reached up and touched his forearm, lightly, just 2 fingers, the way she touched things she was concerned about. "Did you keep people safe?" she said. He looked at her. Her hair was a small disaster from the pillow, and her face was sleep-soft, and her fever had been down for hours. And she was, in this moment, exactly what she always was, the most uncomplicated true thing in his life. "Yeah," he said. "I did." She nodded. She seemed satisfied with that in the specific, practical way that 7-year-olds were satisfied with things when the information was sufficient. "I brought Charlotte's Web," she said. "We didn't get to finish the chapter. We can finish it now." She reached to the nightstand and handed him the book, and he opened it to the dog-eared page, and he sat on the edge of the bed in the small room with the baseboard nightlight while the city did whatever it was doing outside, and he read. He did not think about Thursday's board meeting. He did not think about the encrypted message signed, E, and what it meant for the next few days. He did not think about the offer in the corridor, or the terms, or the salary, or what rebuilding a security infrastructure from scratch actually involved. He thought about nothing except the words on the page and Lily's breathing, which was even and regular and getting slower, and the way the light was in this room, and the particular weight of being exactly where he was. By page 3, she was asleep. He closed the book. He sat for another few minutes in the quiet, his left side aching, his eyes heavy, his hands still. Then he set the book on the nightstand and turned off the nightlight and went to find somewhere to sit until morning. He slept 3 hours on Rosa's couch, which was a floral pattern thing with cushions that were too soft in the wrong places, and he woke up at 5:43 without an alarm because his body had learned long ago that 3 hours was approximately what it got in certain situations, and it should use them efficiently. He lay on the couch for 2 minutes looking at the ceiling and taking inventory. Left ribs, sore, stiffening. The way bruised tissue stiffened overnight, noticeable but functional. Eyes. The specific dryness of insufficient sleep. Everything else, operational. He got up carefully, trying not to wake the house. The kitchen light was already on. Rosa was at the counter with a mug of coffee, reading something on a tablet, and she looked up when he appeared in the doorway with the complete unsurprise of a woman who had correctly estimated when he would be awake. "Coffee," she said, and pointed at the pot. "Thank you." He poured a mug and stood at the counter, and they didn't talk, which was what Rosa seemed to prefer, and what Mason found genuinely restful. The kitchen smelled like coffee and whatever Rosa had been cooking the night before, something with garlic, and the window above the sink was showing the first gray-blue edge of morning. After a few minutes, Rosa said, without looking up from the tablet, "Elena, Mrs. Paula, she's worried about you. She doesn't say it directly, but she's been worried for about 2 years." Mason looked at his coffee. "I know. She thinks you need someone. She might be right." "She is right." Rosa finally looked up. She had the direct eyes of a person who had reached an age where they'd stopped finding tact particularly efficient. You're good at your job, clearly, whatever your job is. You're a good father, also clearly, but you look like a man who's been holding something alone for a long time. Mason thought about several responses and chose. It's been fine. Rosa looked at him with the expression of someone who understood that fine was doing a lot of work in that sentence, but had decided not to press it. Your daughter woke up and asked about you twice before midnight, she said. I told her you were coming. She went back to sleep. Thank you, he said again. She's a good child, Rosa said. Easy to be kind to. She looked back at her tablet. Whatever you're deciding about the job, take the thing that gives her more of you, not less. She won't tell you that herself because she's trying to be good about it. He looked at her. 7-year-olds notice everything, Rosa said. They just don't always have the language for it yet. He drank his coffee and thought about that, and Rosa went back to her tablet, and the morning came in through the window above the sink a little at a time. Asa. Lily woke up at 7:15 demanding waffles that Rosa didn't have the ingredients for, a negotiation that ended with scrambled eggs and toast, and Lily explaining to Mason with great seriousness the complete plot of the television program she'd watched the previous day involving the talking dog. Her fever was gone. Her color was back. She ate the scrambled eggs efficiently, the way she always ate food she was indifferent to, getting through it because food was practical. And she watched her father's face the whole time with the quiet attention she'd always had. When he was loading the plates into Rosa's dishwasher, she appeared at his side. Your side hurts, she said. Little bit. You keep turning to reach things. He looked at her. When did you start noticing that? She thought about it. I don't know, I just noticed stuff, like you. She leaned against the counter next to him. She was 7 years old and the top of her head came to his elbow. Are we going home? In a little while. I have some things to do first. She nodded. She seemed to be deciding whether to ask the thing she actually wanted to ask, which he could see in the specific way she looked at the counter rather than at him. Lily, he said. I'm not worried, she said immediately. I know, but you can ask. She looked up at him. Is the job you were doing yesterday? Is it something you could keep doing? Like, more than just yesterday. He dried his hands on the dish towel and looked at her properly. Maybe. I'm thinking about it. Is it good work? What do you mean by good? She seemed to consider this with genuine effort. Like, does it help people? Not just make money. Does it actually help? He thought about the main floor. About Hargrove, who'd stayed at a hospital for 2 hours with a broken arm rather than an overnight, because he believed in what Victoria was building. About Nadia in the North Corridor for 22 minutes with 3 personnel incoming. About the investigator Farrar with her hand notebook and her compressed shorthand, doing the patient work of documenting what had actually happened. Yeah, he said. It helps. She nodded slowly. Okay. Then, does it pay better than what you do now? He almost laughed. It startled out of him, a genuine, brief sound that he hadn't anticipated. Yeah, Bug, it pays better. Good, she said simply, and pushed off the counter and went to say goodbye to Rosa. He dropped Lily at Mrs. Paola's by 9:30. Mrs. Paola opened the door before he knocked, looked at him with the practiced assessment of a woman who had learned to read the specific way he held himself after difficult things, and said only, I'll make soup for tonight. Go do what you need to do. He called Victoria from the car at 9:47. She answered on the second ring, which told him she'd already been awake and working for some time. I need to see the surveillance documentation, he said. Everything from the Harwick building. The original camera records before the repositioning, the access logs, the communication data from the sub-level staging. Before Thursday, I need to understand the full scope. A pause. That's not a yes, she said. It's not a no either. I need to understand what I'm walking into. That's fair. He heard her moving somewhere, she's shoes on a hard floor, then a door. The federal team pulled everything last night. Farrar's people have the primary copies. Our internal team made a complete parallel copy before handover, which is standard in these situations. Another pause. I can have you in a secure review room at our downtown offices by 11. I'll be there at 11. He drove. The Sterling Consolidated corporate offices occupied the top 8 floors of a building downtown that looked, from the outside, like many buildings downtown. Glass, vertical lines, the particular visual language of corporate authority. The lobby was marble and minimalist. The security desk was staffed by 2 people who both checked his ID and compared him to a list, and the elevator required a key card that a third person escorted him to from the desk. He noted 3 points of verification before the elevator. Good. Standard for this level, but executed with less complacency than he'd seen in similar buildings. He also noted the camera in the lobby was correctly positioned, both of them, small things. Victoria met him on the 31st floor herself, which he hadn't expected. He'd expected Hargrove or an assistant. And she was in clothes that were different from yesterday, but had the same quality of having been selected with care rather than unconscious habit. She looked tired in the specific way that people look tired when they hadn't slept more than 4 hours, but had been on the phone for much of the remaining time. "How's your side?" she said. "Fine." She looked at his left arm angle. "It's functioning," he said. "I'll accept that." She walked him down a corridor past a series of offices, most of which were either empty or occupied by people who looked up briefly and then returned to screens. "Hargrove is in the secure review room. His arm is in a proper cast now. He's somewhat irritated about it, and he insisted on being present for this." "Good. I want him there." "He'll be pleased to hear you say that. He's been performing self-sufficiency since 7 a.m. She pushed open a door at the end of the corridor. The secure review room was exactly what it was called. No windows, reinforced door, a table with 4 chairs and 2 large screens, and a central terminal that Hargrove was currently operating with the careful one-handedness of a man who had reconfigured his workflow around a left arm in a cast, and was not discussing this. He looked up when Mason came in. They'd been through something significant together the previous day, and the way men who'd been through significant things together acknowledged each other tended to be minimal. A nod, a brief mutual recognition of shared context, and then back to the task. "The full surveillance package," Hargrove said. "I've organized it chronologically. 4 primary datasets: the Harwick Building's own CCTV archive, our event security camera network, the access control logs for the full building, and the communication intercepts from the sub-level staging equipment. The federal team has verified copies of all 4. Mason sat down. Victoria sat to his right. Hargrove turned the screens toward them. "Start with the access logs," Mason said. They went through it methodically, and it took 2 hours, and it was not exciting in the way that the previous day had been. It was the opposite of exciting. It was patient and incremental, and required the same quality of attention that finding a reversed badge in a crowd required, applied to columns of data and timestamp sequences and personnel credential records. What emerged from that patience was a picture that was both clearer and more troubling than Mason had expected. The operation had not been constructed in days. The earliest irregular access records in the Harwick Building system went back 11 weeks. The first indication that someone with Elaine Marsh's credentials had been accessing event infrastructure data that had no legitimate operational reason to be in her purview. 11 weeks of preparation, 11 weeks of building the mechanisms, inserting the personnel, arranging the credential forgeries, identifying the candidates who would be selected for the competition, and assessing which of them might pose problems. "They flagged you," Hargrove said, pointing to a subsection of the communication intercepts. "Specifically, 6 days before the event. Your referral came in and someone ran a deeper check than the standard background process." Mason looked at the intercept. His name, his referral source, a notation that read, "Federal redaction, unusual depth, verify threat level." "They couldn't open the file," he said. "No, the federal redaction blocked them, which appears to have made them more concerned rather than less." Hargrove pulled up another document. "This communication, 3 days before the event, references you by candidate number. They're discussing whether to flag your invitation as declined, essentially remove you from the pool before you arrived." "Why didn't they?" "They couldn't do it without leaving a record. The invitation process was documented, and removing a specific candidate without stated cause would have created a discrepancy that could be reviewed later. So they left you in and arranged the positioning of Calloway to monitor you." Mason thought about Calloway at the entrance that morning. You should have rescheduled. The smile that didn't reach the eyes. The question at the lunch table. Does she know what you used to do? He wasn't assessing my candidacy, Mason said. He was assessing whether I was a threat to the operation. Correct. And he reported back that your morning performance was… Hargrove scrolled. The word used is problematic. He recommended escalating the contingency plan by 2 hours. Victoria, who had been reading the documents quietly beside Mason, said, That's when the camera was repositioned. Yes, Hargrove said. She looked at Mason. You forced their timeline. Involuntarily. But you did. The operation was originally planned for the end of the final assessment. They moved it forward because of you, which compressed their preparation and left gaps. She paused, including the gap that let Hargrove's external team get inside. Mason thought about that. The chain of it. A camera 3 degrees off axis noticed at 6 in the morning, and the noticing of it, and the subsequent attention to everything else, and the flag to Hargrove, and the adjustment to the timeline, and the compressed contingency, and the gap. Small things, cascading. What about Calloway's background? He said. Hargrove pulled up a separate document. Derek Calloway is a registered security consultant. His company, Calloway Protective Services, was established 14 months ago. Before that, 8 years in private military contracting, 3 years domestic, and before that, he paused. Law enforcement, 6 years, 2 departments. He was terminated from his second department following an internal affairs investigation. The findings were sealed. What was the allegation? Unauthorized disclosure of protected information to a private party, which is a clean description of selling what he knew to someone who would pay for it. Hargrove set the tablet down. He's been operating in this capacity for approximately 3 years. The Marsh operation was not his first. Mason looked at the screen. Calloway's face in a credential photo from the event registration, the jaw, the composed expression, the eyes that assessed rather than connected. Is he talking? He said. His lawyer arrived at 8 this morning. He has not spoken since. Hargrove paused. Carolyn Marsh also has legal representation. She is, however, talking. Her lawyer can't stop her from talking, apparently, because what she's talking about is the degree to which she was operated by people who had, as she puts it, significantly misrepresented the nature of the arrangement. Victoria made a sound that was not quite a laugh. She's positioning for a lesser charge. Aggressively, Hargrove agreed. What's she saying about Elaine? Hargrove was quiet for a moment. She says Elaine was the architect, that the initial concept, the mechanism of using the security summit as a controlled environment, was Elaine's design, and that Carolyn was brought in for the execution component. Another pause. She also says Elaine told her, 3 days before the event, that she intended to walk it back, that Elaine had changed her mind about the full scope of the operation. Victoria looked at the table. Carolyn says she told Elaine the operation was already in motion and couldn't be walked back without risk to both of them, Hargrove continued, and that Elaine said he consulted the screen. Quote, then I'll do it differently, and then sent the message. The room was quiet. Mason thought about a woman who had built the mechanism that nearly destroyed the person she worked for, and then, at the last moment, used what she'd built to try to stop it. Not cleanly, not heroically, just a person who got to a place they couldn't go further and turned around in the only way available. He thought, that's not redemption, but it might be as close as some situations allow. Where is she now? He said. Federal custody, cooperative witness status, pending formal agreement. Hargrove looked at Victoria. The federal team says her documentation is comprehensive. She kept records of everything. Every communication, every financial transaction, every personnel decision. She was protecting herself, Mason said. Yes, or, Hargrove said carefully, she always knew she might need to prove what had actually happened. Victoria looked at her hands. I want to talk to her, she said. Hargrove straightened slightly. I know it's not standard procedure. I know her lawyers will object and the federal team will object, and Hargrove, I know you're about to tell me it's not advisable. It's not advisable, Hargrove said. I want to do it anyway. She looked at him. Not now, not this week. After the legal process has established its structure and there's a proper framework for it. She paused. I'm not doing it for evidence. I want to understand how someone I trusted built a machine designed to destroy me and then sent a message at the last moment trying to stop it. Hargrove looked at her for a long moment. Then he wrote something on his notepad with his good hand. I'll find out what's possible. Thank you. Mason was looking at the screen, at the access log timestamps, at the 11 weeks of preparation laid out in data. He was thinking about something that had been sitting at the edge of his attention since the previous night when Hargrove had said the Federal Financial Crimes Team and Victoria had said the board meeting is Thursday. The three executives, he said, the ones named in Elaine's message. Victoria looked at him. Has anyone talked to them directly, outside of whatever the federal process looks like? I spoke briefly to Chow last night, Victoria said. Morrison and Pendleton I haven't spoken to directly. Their lawyers contacted our legal team early this morning. Pendleton's debt exposure. Is it the kind that requires immediate action, or the kind that can be managed with time and structure? Victoria's expression changed slightly. She was following where he was going. It's manageable if someone with the right resources helped manage it, which is presumably why he was vulnerable to being pressured. Right. Which means the pressure came from someone who knew about the debt, offered to solve it, and asked for something in return. He looked at her. Does that someone have identifiable financial exposure now, as a result of what's been documented? Hargrove sat up slightly. If the financial crimes team can trace the mechanism of how Pendleton was pressured, Mason continued, they can probably find the source. And the source of that kind of leverage usually has their own leverage problems, because people who buy compliance with other people's debt tend to have complicated financial arrangements themselves. Hargrove was already on his tablet. Marsh and Calloway were the executors, Mason said. Elaine built the internal mechanism. But an operation this size, 11 weeks, multiple personnel, credential forgeries, the board infiltration, that needs a financial infrastructure. Someone funded it. Victoria looked at him. You think the three board members are a thread? Pendleton specifically. Whoever approached him knew about his exposure before it was publicly documented. That means they had access to private financial records. Either they're inside your company at a level above Elaine, or they're outside it and they've been running an intelligence operation on Sterling Consolidated for longer than 11 weeks. The room was quiet. Hargrove looked up from his tablet. I need to make some calls, he said. Do that, Victoria said. He left the room. They sat in the quiet for a moment, the screen still showing the timestamp logs, the access records, the data that told a story of patient malicious construction. You've been thinking about this since last night, Victoria said. Since the sub-level corridor, he said. Carolyn Marsh walked into that arena like it was hers. That's not the posture of someone running an operation for someone else. That's the posture of someone who believes in the goal independent of the contract. He paused. Which means she believed the goal, removing you, forcing the governance crisis, seizing the company's operational control, was worth doing, not just worth being paid to do. She wanted the company, or someone she was aligned with did, and they offered her a piece of it. He looked at the screen. Calloway was contract. The planted personnel were contract, but Marsh was invested. Which means there's a principle behind her, Victoria said quietly. Someone who had a strategic interest in Sterling Consolidated specifically. Yes. She was quiet. Then, I have competitors. Every company at this scale has competitors, and I have people who were passed over for positions I hold, or positions my company controls. And I have people who lost significant money when I restructured the Eastern portfolio 2 years ago. She paused. I don't have a short list. Farrar will build one, he said. The financial documentation Elaine brought in will accelerate it. Victoria looked at the screen for a moment. Then she looked at him. Is this why you wanted to come in today? Not just to understand what happened, but to understand what's still happening, he said. Yes. She looked at him steadily. You haven't given me an answer yet. I know. You've spent the last 2 hours helping me work through the problem as if you were already in the position. He thought about that. She wasn't wrong. Old habit, he said. Or, she said, a different kind of answer. He didn't respond to that directly. He looked at the access log on the screen, at his own name in the candidate records, at the notation federal redaction, unusual depth, verify threat level, and thought about the people who had looked at that notation and been unsettled by what they couldn't see. He thought, the things they couldn't see were the things that mattered. Before I say yes, he said, I need to tell you some things about what I used to do. Not details. I told you I won't give details, but the shape of it. Because if you're going to trust me with your protection, you should understand what that redacted file means in practical terms. Victoria looked at him carefully. All right. I operated in environments where the law was a reference point rather than a constraint, where the objectives were defined by people above my pay grade and my job was execution, not evaluation. I was good at it. I was very good at it. He paused. Some of what I was good at, I'm not proud of. Not because it was wrong in the context it happened in. I can usually make a case for the context, but because contexts change, and some of those cases don't hold as well in daylight as they did in the moment. Victoria didn't look away. I got out because of Lily, he said. That's true, and it's complete. But I also got out because I'd reached the end of my ability to keep telling myself that the context was sufficient justification. That's a personal thing. It doesn't mean the work was wrong. It means I wasn't the right person for it anymore. And now? Now I'm telling you this because you should know what you're bringing in. Not a person with a clean record and a documented history. A person with a redacted file and a specific skill set and the particular moral history of someone who operated at the edge of authorization for 8 years and has been thinking about what that means for 7 more. Victoria was quiet for a moment. Do you think I'm a good judge of character? She said. Based on the last 24 hours, yes. Then trust that. She paused. I'm not hiring your history. I'm hiring what I watched you do yesterday and what you just told me and what it means that you told me when you didn't have to. She looked at the screen and then back at him. The people who don't tell me things, those are the ones I worry about. He sat with that. Thursday, he said. The board meeting. Yes. What do you need between now and then? She considered. The financial documentation organized in a format that's immediately usable in a board context. Hargrove working with Farrar's team on the remaining security assessment for the building and my personal protection gaps. And she paused. Someone to sit across from me tomorrow morning and tell me honestly whether the case is as solid as I think it is or whether I'm seeing what I want to see. That's a different job than personal security. Yes, she said, it is. He looked at her. She looked at him. The screens glowed quietly with their columns of evidence and timestamps. I'll be here at 8 tomorrow morning, he said. That's still not a formal yes. No, but it's what I've got today. She seemed to accept that. 8 tomorrow, she said. Bring coffee. The machine on this floor is broken, and Hargrove keeps pretending it isn't. The rest of Tuesday was the kind of work that didn't look like anything from the outside. Mason spent 4 hours in the review room with a junior analyst named Brendan, who was 24 years old and terrifyingly fast with data visualization, and who had apparently been awake since the previous night organizing the financial documentation from Elaine's submission into something that could be presented to a non-technical board audience. Mason spent those 4 hours telling Brendan what was important and what was context, which were two different things. And Brendan spent those 4 hours translating Mason's assessments into slide formats and summary documents. By 3 p.m., they had a 40-minute presentation that was, Mason thought, about as clear as 40 minutes of financial conspiracy documentation could be. It wouldn't be comfortable, but it would be comprehensible, which was what mattered. Hargrove appeared at the review room door at 3:30 with his cast and a look that said he'd made progress. The financial trace on Pendleton's debt mechanism, he said. Farrar's team moved fast. The instrument used to acquire Pendleton's exposure was a private financial vehicle registered in Delaware 14 months ago. Same month Callaway's company was registered. Mason looked up from the screen. The beneficial owner of the Delaware vehicle is obscured through 3 layers of holding structures, Hargrove continued. Standard offshore arrangement takes time to pierce. But Farrar's team found a co-signatory on one of the sub-accounts, an individual named Garrett Lowe. He paused. Who is the managing partner of Low Capital Partners, which is a private equity firm that made a formal acquisition approach to Sterling Consolidated 17 months ago? Victoria appeared in the doorway behind Hargrove. She had clearly heard this from the corridor. Her face did something controlled and specific. "Low," she said. "You know him," Mason said. "I rejected his acquisition offer personally. It was a structured buyout approach. Not hostile, technically, but the terms were designed to give his firm operational control within 18 months while keeping the Sterling name as a brand shell." She paused. "I told him the company wasn't for sale. He said he'd revisit the conversation when circumstances changed." She looked at Hargrove. 17 months ago. 2 months before the Delaware vehicle was registered, Hargrove said. The room absorbed that sequence. The acquisition offer rejected. The private vehicle registered. The 14 months of patient construction. Elaine recruited or turned. The board members identified and pressured. The event infrastructure compromised. Callaway engaged. Carolyn Marsh positioned. 17 months of work, all traceable back to a rejected offer, and a man who'd said, "I'll revisit the conversation when circumstances change," and then set about engineering the circumstances. He thought, Mason said slowly, that if the company experienced a sufficiently destabilizing crisis, CEO under duress, governance structure compromised, board confidence collapsed, the valuation would drop and the board would be receptive to an acquisition as a stabilization mechanism. "A rescue acquisition," Victoria said flatly. He was going to come in as the solution to a problem he'd created. Yes. She was very still. "Is any of this provable?" "The Delaware vehicle and the co-signature are documented. The acquisition approach is on record. The timeline connects." Mason looked at Hargrove. "Is Farrar's team on low?" "Since 2 hours ago," Hargrove said. "She said, and I'm quoting, 'Tell your principal we've seen this structure before and we know where to pull.'" Victoria exhaled. "Okay." She came into the room fully and sat down, and for a moment she just sat, elbows on the table, hands pressed together, looking at the screen. Not at anything specific on it, just looking. Then she said, "He sat across from me in my conference room 17 months ago. We had coffee. He had a good suit and very organized pitch materials, and he smiled when I said no, like someone who is used to people saying no as an opening position." She paused. "I thought he'd accepted it." "He did accept it," Mason said. "He just decided to try a different approach. By destroying everything I built. By restructuring the circumstances." She looked at him. "Is there a version of what you just said that isn't a euphemism?" "No," he said. "I was trying to give you a version that wasn't only about anger. Anger's not useful right now." She looked at him for a long moment, then, surprising him slightly, "You're right." She straightened up. "Okay. Thursday, we present the documentation to the board. Pendleton's exposure, the mechanism of his coercion, the financial trace to the Delaware vehicle, the timeline connecting low capital to the operation. The no-confidence motion doesn't just fail, it becomes evidence of the crisis we survived." "Yes." "The board sees that Sterling Consolidated, under my leadership, identified and neutralized a 17-month hostile operation by a private equity firm, protected its leadership structure, and delivered the perpetrators to federal investigators." She paused. "That's not a vulnerability. That's a proof of concept." Hargrove looked at her with the expression of someone who had worked for her long enough to know that she was at her most effective when she was angry about something and had converted the anger into strategy. "Exactly right," he said. "Then let's make sure Thursday is exactly that." She looked at Mason. "I need you there." He looked at her. "Not as security," she said, "as the person who identified the operation. The board needs to hear the sequence from someone who was in the building." She paused. "You don't have to speak for long, but your presence and your account create a chain of witness that the documentation alone doesn't." He thought about sitting in a Sterling Consolidated boardroom in front of people he hadn't met, describing a day he'd spent in a competition he'd nearly not attended, in a wrinkled suit with cold coffee after 2 hours of sleep. "My suit is still wrinkled," he said. Victoria looked at him. "We have a corporate account with a tailor 2 blocks from here." I'm not wearing someone else's suit. I'm suggesting you get your suit cleaned and pressed, not replaced. She paused. Though if you want a new one, that's also fine. No, he thought. I'll iron it. She almost smiled again. It was the same almost smile as the night before, the one that existed in the territory adjacent to actual smiling, and he was beginning to understand it as the genuine expression rather than the performed one. Thursday at 9, she said. Boardroom is on the 34th floor. I'll have coffee. Bam. He picked Lily up from Mrs. Paula's at 6. She came to the door with her backpack already on, which meant she'd packed it herself, which meant she'd been ready to leave for at least an hour and had been patiently not asking when he was arriving. Hi, Bug, he said. Hi. She came out and he helped her with the backpack strap. Mrs. Paula made soup. I heard. She put crackers in it. A pause. The flat ones, not the round ones. Okay. I prefer the round ones. I know. He thanked Mrs. Paula, who handed him a container of leftover soup with the wordless precision of a woman performing a concrete act of care, and they walked to the car. In the car, Lily sat in the back seat with her hands in her lap and looked out the window at the passing street. She did that sometimes, just looked without narrating, which was unusual for a 7-year-old, and was one of the things about her that he couldn't fully account for, except to think that she'd spent a lot of her earliest years in proximity to a father who processed things quietly and had developed the habit by observation. We're going to be okay, he said, after a few blocks. She looked at the window. I know. I mean, money-wise, schedule-wise. He paused. I'm probably going to take a new job. It's going to mean some changes. I'm not sure exactly what yet, but I wanted to tell you. She thought about this. The job from yesterday? Yes. The one where you kept people safe? Yes. She turned to look at the back of his head. Is she nice? The person you'd be keeping safe? He thought about Victoria in the corridor at 11 p.m., tired in a real way, asking about Lily's name. Victoria amending the terms of the offer before he'd responded because she wanted it to work for both of them. Yeah, he said. She's good. Lily turned back to the window. She seemed to be working through something internally, doing the math of a 7-year-old evaluating a change she didn't have all the variables for. Will you still pick me up from school? She said. When I can. Not every day, maybe. But when I can. He paused. We'd have enough money to fix the refrigerator. She considered this. It makes a bad noise, she said. I know. Okay, she said. Just that. Then she went back to looking out the window, and he drove them home through the Tuesday evening traffic. And the city did its city thing around them, indifferent and functional and full of people going to the places they needed to be. Wednesday morning, 8 a.m., he was at the Sterling Consolidated offices with 2 cups of coffee from the place 2 blocks down. He'd looked it up the night before, read the reviews, settled on the one that had the least amount of description about their process and sourcing, which usually meant they were focused on actually making good coffee. Victoria was already in the conference room on the 31st floor. She looked at the coffee cups and said, You brought 2. One is yours. She took it. She looked at the side of the cup, which was plain, just the shop's name in small type. She took a sip. Okay, she said. That's good. They don't have a story about their coffee, he said. That usually means the coffee is the story. She looked at him. Sit down. We have 40 minutes before Hargrove gets here, and I want to go through the board presentation before he adds 17 clarifying caveats to everything. He sat down. They went through it. He told her when the sequence was clear and when it wasn't. He told her when a piece of evidence was strong and when it required the other pieces to hold its weight. He told her when her instinct to lead with the financial documentation was right and when her instinct to lead with the surveillance was wrong, and why. She argued with him twice. On the second argument, she was right, and he told her so. By the time Hargrove arrived at 8:40 with his cast and his caveats, they had a presentation that Mason thought would do what it needed to do. He didn't say, I'll take the job. Not that morning. But he sat across the table from her and told her honestly what was strong and what wasn't, which was what she'd asked for. And she listened and pushed back and listened again. And it felt like something that had its own momentum now, something that had been building since 6 in the morning the previous day, when he'd stood outside the Harwick Convention Center and assessed 6 security personnel and 1 camera pointed 3 degrees off axis. Hargrove, at one point, looked at the 2 of them going back and forth over a particular section of the financial evidence, and he wrote something in his notepad that Mason didn't see and didn't ask about. The meeting ran long. It always did when the work was real. Thursday arrived the way consequential things arrived. Not dramatically, but inevitably, the natural endpoint of the sequence that had begun Tuesday morning in an ordinary elevator on the way to a competition, Mason had nearly not attended. He ironed his suit the night before. It took 12 minutes, and the crease on the right shoulder was better but not perfect, because the fabric had been wrinkled long enough that the memory was in the material. He wore it anyway. Lily had inspected it before school, with the seriousness of someone performing a quality check, announced that it was mostly fine, and then gone back to her cereal. At 8:30, he dropped her at school. She got out of the car and shouldered her backpack and turned back to the window. "Tell me how it goes," she said. "I will." "At dinner," she specified. "Tell me at dinner." "Deal," he said. She turned and walked through the school entrance without looking back, which was her standard operating mode. She said her goodbyes, and then she was done with them, which was efficient, and also, he sometimes thought, her way of making departures easier for both of them. He drove to the Sterling Consolidated Building and went up to the 34th floor, where the boardroom was, and where Victoria was standing outside the door with a coffee already in her hand and an expression that was composed in the specific way that people who were about to walk into difficult rooms were composed. Not calm, exactly, but settled. Ready. She looked at his suit. "The shoulder," she said. "I know." "It's fine," she said. "It looks like what it is." "What is it?" Someone who was doing something more important than ironing. She turned toward the boardroom door. "Ready?" He thought about 11 weeks of someone else's preparation, and 1 day of showing up without expecting anything, and the camera, and the badge, and the ribs, and Lily's hands with 2 fingers on his arm saying, "Did you keep people safe?" "Yeah," he said. She opened the door. The boardroom had 12 chairs and 11 people in them, and the 12th chair, at the head of the table, was Victoria's, and she walked to it without hesitation and sat down. And Mason took the chair along the side wall that Hargrove had told him would be there, and the room looked at him with the collective attention of people who had been told to expect something and were now calibrating whether the reality matched the description. Victoria set her coffee down. "Let's get started," she said. The boardroom had the particular silence of a space where consequential things happened regularly enough that the room itself had absorbed something of that weight. 12 chairs, 11 people, the kind of long table that communicated permanence. The kind of room where decisions made in 45 minutes could determine what happened to 3,000 employees and 9 country operations and $1 billion of structured assets. Mason sat against the side wall and watched it begin. Victoria didn't open with the documentation. He'd told her not to. They'd argued about it Wednesday morning, and he'd been right, and she'd acknowledged it. Because leading with evidence in a room full of people who weren't certain what they were being accused of created defensiveness before comprehension. You led with the story. You let the evidence arrive as confirmation of what the story had already made legible. So she started with Tuesday. She described the morning, the competition, the process she'd built over 3 years to identify genuine talent in a field full of performance. She described what she'd observed from the observation suite, a candidate in a wrinkled suit who had put the room's best fighter on the ground in 28 seconds, and then spent the rest of the day identifying threats that no one else had noticed. Morrison, at the far end of the table, shifted in his chair. Victoria didn't look at him. She described the encrypted message. She described Hargrove's arm. She described Calloway and the observation suite, and the communication device, and the 4-minute window that the operation had been designed to create. She described the sub-level staging, the planted personnel, the repositioned camera, the exit lock override. She described it the way Mason had described it to her, as a sequence, one thing leading to the next, the logic of it visible once you laid it in order. Then she said, "The operation was designed by someone inside this company, Someone with access to our authentication systems, our personnel files, our event infrastructure, and our board communications. She paused. And it was funded and directed by someone outside this company who had a specific strategic interest in destabilizing our governance structure. The room was very quiet. Pendleton, 3 chairs to Victoria's left, had gone the color of a man who had spent 48 hours knowing this moment was approaching and had not found a way to make peace with it. Victoria looked at him directly. "Richard," she said, not unkindly, "I know about the debt vehicle. I know how it was used, and I know you believed you didn't have another option." She paused. "I'm not going to ask you to explain yourself in this room, but I need you to understand that what was done to you, the acquisition of your exposure, and its use as leverage, is part of the documented criminal case. You're a victim of it, not the architect. That distinction matters." Pendleton looked at the table. His jaw was tight. He nodded once, very small. Morrison said from the far end, "Victoria, what exactly are you—" "Arthur," her voice stayed level. "You were approached with something different. Financial incentive, not financial threat. I know that too." She looked at him. "I want to understand how a man I promoted twice made the decision he made, but that conversation is not today's conversation. Today's conversation is about the board understanding the full scope of what was attempted and what it means for this company going forward." Morrison looked at the table. The third of the 3, Chow, who had come to Victoria voluntarily before she knew about Elaine, who had been pressured with something she hadn't wanted disclosed, sat with her hands flat on the table and her expression composed in the way of someone who had already done the difficult thing and was waiting to see what came next. Victoria looked at her briefly, a small acknowledgement. Then she looked at the room. "What was attempted," she said, "was a 17-month operation to engineer a governance crisis that would facilitate a hostile acquisition of Sterling consolidated by low-capital partners. The mechanism was internal sabotage, board coercion, and a staged physical threat to the CEO." She paused. "It failed. I want to be precise about why it failed, because I think it matters for how this board understands the company it governs." She turned to Mason. This was the moment they'd prepared. Not rehearsed. He'd refused to rehearse it, because rehearsed testimony in an unrehearsed room sounded like what it was. But prepared. He knew what she needed from him and what she didn't. He stood up. The board looked at him. He was aware of what they were seeing. The sidewall chair, the suit that was better than Tuesday, but still carried the history of having been worn through something. The left arm still angled slightly wrong. "On Tuesday morning," he said, "I arrived at the Harwick Convention Center at 5:41 a.m. The first thing I noticed was a security camera above the left entrance that was pointing 3 degrees off axis from its optimal coverage position." He kept his voice even, factual, the way Farrar had taken her notes. "Over the course of the morning, I identified 7 additional indicators of a compromised security environment. I flagged the situation to your head of security at approximately 3:15 p.m., confirmed the threat with direct intelligence from the sub-level staging area, and coordinated the response that allowed the external protection team to move on the primary threat before the operation's 4-minute window could be activated." He paused. "The reason I could do that," he said, "is that whoever planned the operation built it on an assumption. The assumption was that a competition designed to evaluate security professionals would not produce anyone capable of identifying a genuine threat environment while simultaneously running the evaluation." He looked at the table. "It was a reasonable assumption. Most of the candidates in that room were good at their jobs in the ways the competition was designed to measure. But the competition was also filtering for something that doesn't appear in a resume or a performance metric, the specific habit of attention that makes a person look at a camera and notice 3 degrees." He sat back down. The room was quiet again. Then one of the board members he hadn't met, a woman named Hartwell, who ran the company's international portfolio and who had been watching him with the careful attention of someone taking inventory, said, "Are you the position she's restructuring the protection infrastructure around?" "I haven't formally accepted yet," Mason said. Hartwell looked at Victoria. Victoria looked at Mason. He looked back at the room. "But I'll be here Monday morning," he said, "if that answers the question." Hartwell wrote something down. The board meeting ran 2 hours and 14 minutes. The no confidence motion, which had been formally submitted by Morrison and co-signed by Pendleton, was formally withdrawn by Morrison 22 minutes into the presentation without being asked. He withdrew it the way a person withdrew something they'd already understood was indefensible, not dramatically, just quietly, with the particular diminishment of someone who had made a calculation and discovered the calculation was wrong. Pendleton didn't withdraw the co-signature. He didn't have to. When Morrison withdrew the primary submission, the co-signature became moot, and Pendleton sat for the rest of the meeting with his hands on the table and the expression of someone working through a private reckoning that had nothing to do with board procedure. The documentation package, Brendan's 40-minute presentation, which Hargrove delivered from the connected laptop with his one functional hand, ran through the financial trace, the Delaware vehicle, the low capital connection, and the full operational timeline. It was, Mason thought, as clear as 40 minutes of financial conspiracy could be. The board received it the way people received things that were both complicated and obvious once explained, with the specific attention of people who were recalibrating their understanding of a situation they'd been inside without fully seeing. At the end of the presentation, Hartwell said, "What's the status of Lowe?" Hargrove answered, "The Federal Financial Crimes Team has a formal inquiry open. His counsel contacted their office yesterday morning, which means he was aware by Tuesday night that the operation had failed and that the trace was running." He paused. Based on Agent Farrar's assessment, the inquiry will advance to charges within 30 days. The documented connection between the Delaware vehicle and his firm's co-signatory is, in her words, unusually clean. Meaning? Meaning Elaine Marsh kept thorough records. He paused. She kept records of everything. The room absorbed that. Chow said quietly from her seat, "What happens to her?" Victoria looked at her. "The federal process determines that. She's a cooperative witness. The documentation she provided materially advanced the investigation." She paused. "Beyond that, I don't know yet." "Do you want to know?" Chow said. It wasn't a hostile question. It had the quality of someone asking something they genuinely wanted the answer to. Victoria was quiet for a moment. "Yes," she said. "I want to understand it, not forgive it. That's not my job and it's not this board's job, but understand it." She looked at the table. "Someone I trusted built something designed to destroy what I built, and then stopped it. I want to understand how both of those things were true of the same person." The room didn't have an answer for that. Neither did Mason, but he thought it was the right question. The honest question. The kind of question that only people who were genuinely trying to understand the world, rather than just manage it, asked. The board meeting ended at 11:22. The members filed out in ones and twos, the particular dispersal of a group that had processed something significant and needed the privacy of their own heads to finish processing it. Hartwell stopped at the door and said, to Victoria, "Well run," in a tone that contained more than 2 words. Victoria nodded. Morrison left without speaking. Pendleton paused near the door and looked at Victoria, and there was a moment where something might have been said and nothing was said, and then he left. Chow stopped next to Mason on her way out. She looked at him directly. "You were in the room when Calloway had the device," she said. "Yes." "And you—" She seemed to be looking for the right word. "Fixed it," he said. She looked at him a moment longer. "Thank you," she said. She went out. Mason and Victoria were the last 2 in the room, the long table, the 12 chairs, the particular quiet of aftermath. The coffee Victoria had brought was cold in its cup. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city was doing its mid-morning thing, indifferent and perpetual. "Hartwell likes you," Victoria said. "She doesn't know me. She likes what she saw. That's how Hartwell works." Victoria gathered the papers in front of her. The legal pad, the documentation printouts, the notes she'd made in her compressed handwriting during the meeting. "Morrison is going to resign from the board. He won't be asked to. He'll do it himself. It's the only move that preserves anything for him." She paused. "Pendleton I'm less sure about. He might stay and try to rebuild it. He might not be able to." "What do you want?" She thought about it. "I want the company to function. I want the board to be composed of people who are here for the right reasons." She looked at her papers. I don't have the energy to want things beyond that right now. That's a reasonable place to be. It's not very inspiring. No, he said, but it's honest. She looked at him. Monday morning, she said. You said Monday morning. Yes. That's 3 days. I have things to do. What things? He thought about the refrigerator that made a sound, the heat bill, the medical bills that were manageable now but had been managed through a particular combination of frugality and anxiety for 7 years. He thought about Mrs. Paola's face when she handed him the soup container, the concrete act of care from a woman who filled the space that was empty in his life with soup and quiet watching and gentle accuracy about things he didn't address directly. He thought about Rosa in the kitchen at 5:43 in the morning saying, "Take the thing that gives her more of you." He thought about Lily's 2 fingers on his forearm. "I need to tell my daughter properly," he said. "Not in the car, not in passing. Sit down and tell her what's changing and what's not, and give her the space to have opinions about it." He paused. "She'll have opinions." "How many?" "Several. They'll be delivered seriously and require genuine engagement." Victoria looked at him. "What's she like?" He thought about how to answer that. People asked about Lily in a general way sometimes. What's she like? How old? Is she in school? And the general answer was easy. 7, 2nd grade, she's good. But the actual answer was more specific and took longer. "She notices things," he said. "Not the way I notice things. I was trained for it. She just does it naturally. She watches people. She picks up on the structure of situations." He paused. "She's also capable of being completely absorbed by a book about a spider and a pig for 45 minutes, and then emerging and asking why the spider had to die. And the question is genuinely philosophical, not just 7-year-old sad." He stopped. "She's specific. Most people find her easy to be around because she doesn't perform. She is just whatever she is, straightforwardly." Victoria was listening with the expression of someone receiving information they were keeping. "She sounds like someone I'd like to meet," Victoria said. He looked at her. "Maybe," he said. "I'm not making a request," she said immediately. "Just an observation." "I know." He thought about it. "Maybe," he said again, which was different from the first. Maybe in a way he couldn't fully articulate, but that felt accurate. Victoria looked at her cold coffee. "Go home, Mason," she said. "Monday at 8. Bring the same coffee." "The place without the story." "Yes." She paused. "And iron the suit again." "It's as good as it's going to get." She looked at his shoulder. "I know," she said. "I meant, do it anyway. The doing of it matters, even if the result is the same." He thought about that. He picked up his jacket from the chair back and put it on, and the shoulder crease was what it was, and he thought, she's right, and also she's describing something larger than a suit, and she probably knows that. "Monday," he said. "Monday," she said. He left. He did not go home immediately. He sat in his car in the Sterling Consolidated Parking Structure for 11 minutes, which was not something he'd planned to do. He just sat there with the engine off and the particular quality of stillness that arrived when the operational part of his brain finally acknowledged that the sequence was complete. Tuesday's competition, Wednesday's review room, Thursday's board meeting, the financial trace, the testimony, the withdrawal of the motion, the inquiry into low capital, the cooperative witness status of Elaine Marsh, the federal process that was now running on its own momentum and didn't require him. Done. Not resolved in the way that stories resolved. Not neatly, not without remainder. Pendleton would carry what he'd been part of for longer than this week. Morrison would resign from the board and then have to figure out what came after resignation. Carolyn Marsh was facing a federal process that would take years. Elaine was in a version of the same process from a different angle. Calloway had lawyers and silence and the patience of someone who'd been in difficult situations before. Garrett Lowe of Low Capital Partners was watching a 30-day clock run toward charges somewhere in the city, probably in a very good suit, and Harwick Convention Center would eventually go back to hosting conferences and conventions and whatever else large glass and steel buildings hosted. And the camera above Exit 1 would be correctly positioned again. and the scuff marks on the padded combat assessment floor would be covered by the next event setup, and the room where 28 seconds had changed the temperature of a Tuesday morning would be a conference hall for a dental industry expo or a regional insurance gathering or whatever came next. That was how it actually ended, not in a single moment, but in the long dispersal of consequences, which were still running and would keep running for a while. He was okay with that. He started the car. He drove to Lily's school, which let out at 3:15, and he was 40 minutes early, so he parked on the street outside and sat with the windows down and the sounds of a residential neighborhood in early afternoon. A dog somewhere, a leaf blower 2 houses down, a woman walking past with a stroller who was talking on the phone with the specific focus of someone managing 2 things at once. He thought about what Rosa had said. Take the thing that gives her more of you, not less. He thought about the last 7 years. The apartment with the refrigerator that made a sound, the ironed suit that never came out quite right, the nights reading Charlotte's Web by baseboard light when Lily had fevers, and the early mornings with cold coffee in a travel mug that had a drawing on it in red marker that had mostly faded. He thought about how the last 7 years had been, in the specific and unadorned sense of the word, hard. Not tragic, not insufficient, just hard, in the way that doing something significant alone was hard. The absence of someone to say, oh, good to when the news was good, and the absence of someone to help carry the decision-making when the decisions were large. He had been, for 7 years, very good at not thinking too specifically about that absence. He'd gotten efficient at it the way you got efficient at working around a physical limitation. You adjusted your reach, you modified your approach, you stopped noticing the adjustment because it had become the baseline. He was thinking about it now. He wasn't sure why. Maybe it was Rosa's kitchen at 5:43. Maybe it was the coffee cup he'd brought without being asked, from the place without a story. Maybe it was the almost smile. Maybe it was none of those things, and just the particular vulnerability of a completed high-pressure sequence when the operational running had stopped and what was left was the person. He didn't resolve it. He sat with it until 3:15, which was not long enough to resolve anything, but was long enough to acknowledge that the thing was there, which was different from what he'd been doing for 7 years. Lily came out of the school entrance with her backpack and her very specific walk. Slightly purposeful, slightly distracted, the walk of a person who was always thinking about something else and moving toward the next thing simultaneously. She spotted the car immediately, which she always did, and her face did the small thing it did when she was pleased. Not a big expression, just a settling, a coming into focus. She got in. Hi, she said. Hi, Bug. How did it go? Good, he said. It went good. She put her seatbelt on. Tell me at dinner, she said, which was what she'd asked for that morning, the specificity of 7 years of a child who understood that full conversations required sitting down with food. Deal, he said. He drove them home. What? Dinner was the soup Mrs. Paula had sent, reheated, with the round crackers from their own cabinet because the flat ones were at Mrs. Paula's and Lily had preferences. And Mason sat across the small kitchen table from his daughter and told her. He told her about the board meeting in the way he'd learned to tell Lily things. Not simplified, not performing simplicity, but calibrated. She was 7, and she was specific, and she didn't need protection from the truth of things. She needed the truth scaled to the information she could actually use. He told her there had been people trying to take something from the woman he'd been protecting, and that he and some colleagues had stopped it, and that today the people responsible for the larger plan had been formally identified and were being dealt with by the appropriate authorities. Lily ate a cracker and processed this. Is she safe now? The woman? Yes, her company is safe. The people who were supposed to stop the bad plan stopped it. Who stopped it? Several people. Me, and a woman named Nadia, and the head of security whose name is Hargrove, and some other people. He paused. And, in a complicated way, someone who had been part of the problem and changed her mind. Lily considered this. Why did she change her mind? I don't know exactly. She decided she couldn't go further with what she'd been part of. Was she sorry? I think so, he said. But sorry and stopped aren't the same thing. She stopped, which mattered more. Lily ate another cracker. She seemed to be adding this to a category she had for complicated people and their complicated decisions, a category she'd been building since she was old enough to ask why Charlotte had to die and get a real answer. "And the job?" she said. "Monday morning," he said. "I'm starting Monday." She nodded slowly, then, "Will you still have time?" "For what?" She looked at him. The look was direct and unperforming, the way she always looked. "For the stuff," she said. "The reading and the school things and when I'm sick." He looked at her across the small kitchen table with the soup and the crackers and the refrigerator that still made its sound in the background. He'd called to schedule the repair that morning, and the technician was coming Saturday, which was one of the first concrete changes that was already real. "I'll figure it out," he said. "I'll make it work." He paused. "But I need you to tell me when it's not working, not just be okay with it when it isn't." She looked at him seriously. "I always tell you things." "I know, I'm just—" He stopped. "I'm saying it matters that you tell me, that I know." She looked at him for a moment with the particular regard of someone deciding whether a thing that had been said was sufficient or required a response. "Okay," she said. Then she went back to her soup. They ate in the comfortable quiet of people who had been in the same house together long enough that silence didn't require filling, and outside the kitchen window the evening was doing what evenings did, the light shifting, the neighborhood settling, the ordinary progress of a day arriving at its natural end. After a while, Lily said, "Did you eat today? Like actual food?" "I had crackers." "Mason?" She had started using his name occasionally in the tone Mrs. Paula used, which was the specific tone of women of various ages who found him inadequate in practical self-maintenance. "I'll eat," he said. "You should have had the soup for lunch." "I was in a meeting." "You could have had the soup and been in the meeting." The meeting was in a boardroom. She seemed to consider whether a boardroom precluded soup. "Still," she said. "Still," he agreed. Saturday, the refrigerator technician came and fixed the sound in 40 minutes for a reasonable amount of money, and Mason stood in the kitchen afterward in the quiet of a working refrigerator and realized he'd gotten so accustomed to the sound that the absence of it was initially stranger than the sound had been. Things you accommodate become invisible. The adjustment becomes the baseline. You stop noticing the thing you're working around until the thing is gone, and then the space it occupied is suddenly legible. He thought about that for a while. Lily was in her room reading. She was on a new book, having finished Charlotte's Web for what he believed was the 4th time, and she'd selected something about a girl who discovered her grandmother had been a spy, which she'd described to him in precise detail, including her assessment of whether the grandmother's cover story was logistically plausible, which it was not, but Lily was willing to extend some credibility in the interest of narrative. He made coffee. He stood at the kitchen counter where the refrigerator was now quiet and drank it and thought about Monday. He thought about what Nadia had said in the corridor. Today wasn't nothing. It wasn't just Tuesday she'd been talking about. He understood that now in a way he hadn't quite processed in the corridor. She'd been talking about 7 years of doing the daily version of Tuesday, of showing up in the wrinkled suit, tired with cold coffee, to a situation that didn't particularly care about his circumstances, and doing the work anyway, the small attentions, the daily assessments, the habit of noticing that couldn't be turned off and that he'd been directing for 7 years at grocery stores and school pickup lines, and the particular way people held themselves in rooms. It wasn't wasted. It was practice that looked like ordinary life. He thought about what Lily had asked in the car the day after Tuesday. Does it help people? Not just make money. Does it actually help? He thought about Victoria's voice when she'd described the board meeting outcome. Not triumphant, just settled. The steadiness of someone who had defended something real. He thought about Hargrove, who had stayed at a hospital for 2 hours with a broken arm and come back and kept working because the work mattered to him independent of the arm. Who had written something in his notepad during the Wednesday meeting that Mason hadn't seen and hadn't asked about and thought he might never ask about because some things didn't need to be surfaced to be understood. He thought about the camera above exit 1, correctly positioned again now, doing its quiet work of seeing without being seen. He finished his coffee. He went to Lily's room and knocked. "Yeah," she said. He opened the door. She was on her bed with the Spy Grandmother book, her socked feet up against the wall in the position she adopted when she was deep into something, which meant she was not particularly attending to the room. "I'm going to go iron my suit," he said. She looked up. "Again?" "For Monday." She considered this. "It's Saturday." "I know." She seemed to find this satisfying in some way she didn't explain. She went back to her book. "Okay," she said. "The iron's in the hall closet." "I know where the iron is." "You never use it." "I used it Thursday." "Barely," she said, with the evaluative precision of someone who had observed the Thursday ironing from the doorway. He went and got the iron. Sunday was quiet, in the way Sundays were quiet when nothing was scheduled. Lily did homework at the kitchen table while Mason made grocery lists, and they went to the store together in the afternoon, and Lily selected the round crackers and examined the soup options with the seriousness of someone who had developed opinions about soup through recent experience, and Mason fixed the loose hinge on the front door that had been loose for 3 months, and they ordered food for dinner because neither of them wanted to cook, and that was a thing you could do when the refrigerator repair was already paid for. Over dinner, Lily said, "I drew something for the woman you're going to work for." He looked at her. "You drew something." "I do that." She said it matter-of-factly. She did do that. She had been drawing things and presenting them to people since she was 4, not as performance, but as a natural extension of how she processed things. She drew for Mrs. Paula sometimes. She'd drawn for Lily's second-grade teacher on the last day of school. She drew as a way of saying things that she'd worked out and wanted to make external. "What did you draw?" he said. She disappeared into her room and came back with a piece of her standard paper. She had a whole stack of it, printer paper from the ream he kept in the hall closet, which she treated as her primary medium, and handed it to him. He looked at it. 3 figures drawn in her particular style, which was economical and expressive in a way that was entirely her own. She didn't draw the way children's art books suggested children drew. She drew the way she looked at things. The figures were standing under a tree. The tree was large, and the branches extended over all 3 figures, and the roots at the bottom of the page were extensive and visible, drawn with particular attention, reaching into the ground in all directions. The 3 figures were different heights. The tallest one had lines around the shoulder area that he recognized as his suit. The shortest one had the particular hair shape that Lily always used when she drew herself. The middle figure was a woman. He looked at it for a long time. "The tree is growing," Lily said. "I made the roots big because I wanted to show it's been there a while. Trees that look big on top usually have roots you can't see." She looked at the drawing in his hands. "The branches cover all 3 of them," she added in case that wasn't clear. He looked at the 3 figures under the branches. "Can I give it to her?" Lily asked. He thought about Victoria's face when she'd repeated Lily's name, the way she'd said it, not performatively interested, just careful with it, like a thing she was putting somewhere specific. "Yeah," he said. "I'll take it Monday." Lily nodded and went back to her dinner. He put the drawing carefully on the kitchen counter and looked at it while he finished eating. The 3 figures under the tree, the roots going deep into the ground, the branches extending over all of them, which was what branches did when the tree had been growing long enough. He thought, she drew 3 people without being asked to draw 3 people. She put the 3rd figure in without being told that there was a 3rd figure to put in. She was 7 years old, and she was drawing the shape of a thing she'd intuited from a car conversation, and a father who was careful about what he said, and not always as careful about what his face did. He thought about Rosa's kitchen. She won't tell you herself because she's trying to be good about it. He thought about Mrs. Paula. She thinks you need someone. He thought about the drawing. The tree in the drawing wasn't young. It wasn't a sapling, just planted, still needing to be established. It was a tree that had been growing for a while, with the visible roots of something that had taken hold in ordinary ground and built itself into something with structural integrity. He didn't know what anything meant with certainty. He wasn't a person who required certainty. He'd spent his adult life operating in environments where the information was always incomplete, and the job was to make the best decision available with what you had, and then stay alert for the new information that would require you to update. He was alert. That was the most honest thing he could say about Monday and what came after it. Monday morning, 8 a.m. He was in the lobby of the Sterling Consolidated Building with 2 coffees from the place without a story, Lily's drawing folded once and placed carefully in his jacket's interior pocket. The suit ironed to the best it was going to be, which was better than Thursday, but still carried the memory of all the times it had been wrinkled. He took the elevator to the 31st floor. Victoria was already in the conference room. She had the legal pad, the pen she used to hold rather than write with, and a second cup of coffee she'd apparently made before remembering the machine on this floor was broken because the cup was sitting at a slight remove from her like something she was reconsidering. She looked up when he came in. He set the better coffee in front of her. She looked at it, then at him. "You're on time," she said. 8 a.m. Some people interpret that loosely. I don't. He sat down. He thought about taking out the drawing and thought about waiting, and then thought that waiting wasn't the right instinct. It was hesitation dressed as consideration, which was a different thing. He took the drawing out of his jacket pocket and unfolded it and put it on the table in front of her. Victoria looked at it. She was quiet for a long moment. She picked it up carefully, the way you picked up something made by a child, not with the exaggerated tenderness of performance, but with the simple care of something you understood was specific and therefore worth handling specifically. She looked at the 3 figures, the tree, the roots. "She drew this," Victoria said, "yesterday. She wanted me to give it to you." Victoria was quiet again. She set the drawing down and looked at it on the table, and her expression did something that was not the executive expression and not the almost smile, but something that lived below both of those, in whatever layer was the actual person rather than the person managing the situation. "The roots," she said. She was explaining that big trees have root systems people don't see, he said. I think it was also about other things, but she didn't elaborate. "No," Victoria said. "She wouldn't need to." They sat with the drawing between them for a moment. Then Victoria said, in a different register, practical, back in the room, "We have a lot of work to start on. The protection infrastructure rebuild, the internal security audit, the protocol review for all 3 events we have scheduled in the next 6 months." She looked at him. "And Farrar called this morning. Lowe's counsel reached out to the federal team over the weekend. There may be a preemptive cooperation agreement in motion. That would accelerate the timeline." "Yes," she paused. "We'd need to be ready to respond if the financial press gets the story before we want them to. That's a communications strategy question as much as a security one, which means I need people who can think across both." She looked at him. "I know that's more than you signed up for." "Monday morning," he said. "We'll figure out what needs figuring." She picked up her pen. He picked up his coffee. The city was doing its Monday thing outside the window. The increased frequency of everything, the return of the week's momentum. And inside the conference room it was quiet and purposeful, and the drawing was on the table between them. They started working. It wasn't easy, because the job was not easy, and the situation it was emerging from was complicated, and the infrastructure they were rebuilding had been compromised at multiple levels that required individual assessment and remediation. Hargrove arrived at 8:30 with his cast and his caveats and his notepad and his fundamental reliability, and Brendan appeared at 9 with 3 screens of data and the focused energy of someone who'd apparently been thinking about the security audit since Thursday. Nadia Reeves, who Mason had called Sunday afternoon with an offer Victoria had authorized, a contract role for the infrastructure review period, arrived at 9:15 with a cup of coffee she'd brought herself and the expression of someone who had assessed the room in the elevator and had already started forming opinions. She looked at Mason. "You said yes," she said. "Monday morning," he said. "I can see that." She sat down, looked at the room, looked at Victoria. "Nice drawing," she said, gesturing at the paper on the table. Victoria looked at it. "A 7-year-old's perspective on organizational resilience," she said. Nadia studied it for a second. "She gave equal branch coverage to all 3 figures," she said. "That's intentional." "Yes," Mason said. Nadia looked at him briefly with an expression that said she understood what the 3 figures were and had no further questions. She opened her notebook. They got to work. Some days had a shape that you only understood afterward. Tuesday had been one of those, a day that looked like a competition and turned out to be something considerably more definitive. A day whose shape Mason had only begun to understand while sitting in Rosa's kitchen at 5:43 in the morning 2 days later. Monday was the opposite. Monday's shape was visible in real time, which was rarer and more useful. The shape of Monday was beginning, not a fresh start. He was too old and had been through too much to believe in the category of fresh start, which required a kind of amnesia he didn't have and wouldn't want. Not a resolution. The threads from Tuesday were still running. Lowe's cooperation agreement, Carolyn Marsh's federal process, Elaine Marsh's complicated navigation of what she'd built and then dismantled, the board's reconstitution, the infrastructure rebuild that would take months, not days. Just beginning. The specific quality of a first day, uncertain, practical, requiring attention, generating information that would be necessary later, impossible to skip. He thought about what he'd told Lily. "I'll make it work." And her response, "I always tell you things," as if that were obvious. As if the telling were already assumed, the only variable being whether he was listening. He was listening. By noon, the whiteboard in the conference room had filled with 3 weeks of prioritized tasks, and Nadia had argued successfully for a different sequencing than Mason's original proposal, and Victoria had made a decision about the external audit firm before anyone had finished presenting the options, which was the fastest decisive moment of the morning, and which Hargrove had accepted with the long-practiced equanimity of someone who had been working with her for 6 years and understood that when she moved quickly, she was usually right. At 12:15, Victoria looked at the whiteboard. "Lunch," she said. "There's a place downstairs that does sandwiches and doesn't try to do anything more interesting than sandwiches, which I find increasingly appealing as a philosophy." Nadia was already standing up. Hargrove was closing his notepad. Brendan was saving his screens. Mason looked at the whiteboard. At the 3 weeks of tasks, the infrastructure, the ongoing federal process, the board reconstitution, the 6-month event calendar, the communications strategy, the things that would need his attention in ways he couldn't fully anticipate yet. He thought about a camera 3 degrees off axis. He thought about the specific quality of attention required to notice it. Not genius, not special equipment, just the daily habit of looking at things properly, maintained over years of ordinary life, until it was simply how he existed in any given environment. He thought, that's the thing. That's what it is. Distilled down. You show up, you pay attention, you do the work that's in front of you with the best of what you have. You tell the people who matter what they need to know. You fix the refrigerator when you have the money. You iron the suit even when it doesn't come out right. You read the chapter, and then something happens. Not the thing you expected, usually not the thing you planned for. Often something that arrives in a wrinkled suit with cold coffee at 6 in the morning looking like nothing in particular. And because you've been paying attention all along, you're ready for it. Or ready enough. Which was, he had come to understand, all that ready actually meant. He got up and followed them to the elevator. 3 weeks later, Lily met Victoria. It wasn't planned, or it was planned in the loose way that things were planned, when a 7-year-old's schedule and a CEO's schedule were being brought into proximity for the first time, and neither one was predictable. Victoria's Thursday evening ran long. Mason had Lily with him because the after-school arrangement had fallen through, and at 5:45, Lily was sitting in the conference room on the 31st floor with her homework spread on one end of the long table, while Mason and Victoria worked at the other end, which was the kind of situation that worked until Lily had finished her homework and had nothing to do. She came to the working end of the table. Victoria looked up. Lily looked at her with the direct assessment she applied to new information. "You're Victoria," she said. "I am," Victoria said. "You must be Lily." "Yes." Lily looked at the documents on the table. She looked at the whiteboard, which had migrated through 3 iterations since Monday, and currently showed a revised infrastructure timeline with color coding that Brendan had introduced and that Mason had accepted because Brendan's system was actually more legible. She looked back at Victoria. "Is the work going okay?" Victoria glanced at Mason briefly, then back at Lily. "Better this week than last week," she said. "That's good. First weeks are usually the hardest." "That's been my experience," Victoria said. Lily seemed to consider her. "I drew you a tree," she said. "Did you keep it?" "It's on my desk," Victoria said. On the actual desk, not in a drawer. Lily nodded, satisfied. The roots are important, she said. People don't usually draw the roots because you can't see them. But that's the part that holds everything up. Victoria looked at her. I thought about that, she said. The roots. What did you think? I thought you were right. Lily looked at the whiteboard again. My dad says the work is good, she said, that it helps people. It does, Victoria said. More people than just me. That's what good work does, Lily said, with the calm certainty of someone stating an established fact. And then she went back to her end of the table and started drawing something on the back of a completed homework sheet. And Mason watched Victoria watch her for a moment, before Victoria looked back at the document in front of her. Neither of them said anything. They didn't need to. The investigation into Garrett Lowe took 4 months, not 30 days, because that's how investigations worked, not the way you wanted them to, at the pace the evidence required. His cooperation agreement with the federal team collapsed in the 3rd week when his counsel decided the terms weren't favorable enough, and then reconstituted in the 6th week when the financial crimes team pierced the 3rd holding structure and found documentation that made the agreement considerably more favorable from everyone's perspective except Lowe's. He was formally charged in the 4th month. The charges included conspiracy to commit securities fraud, unlawful interference with corporate governance, and financial coercion. His lawyer issued a statement describing the charges as politically motivated, which was the statement his lawyer was paid to issue, and which nobody who had seen Farrar's documentation found particularly credible. Carolyn Marsh pleaded to reduce charges and received a sentencing recommendation that reflected her cooperation. She did not speak publicly. Mason didn't know what she and Elaine had said to each other after Elaine turned herself in, and he didn't try to find out, because it was not information that was his to have. Elaine Marsh's case was more complicated, which was accurate to what she'd done and what she'd then done about it. She received a formal cooperation agreement that reduced her exposure substantially in exchange for the completeness of her documentation. She didn't receive immunity. Some of what she'd built caused consequences that her cooperation couldn't entirely undo, which was, Mason thought, the most honest possible outcome of a situation like hers. Calloway took a plea in the 5th month. He said nothing public before or after. Morrison resigned from the board in the 2nd week, as Victoria had predicted. Pendleton stayed and, over the following months, became one of the more reliable votes on governance questions. Not from guilt, Mason thought, but from the specific clarity that arrived when someone who'd been coerced finally understood what the coercion had been designed to produce and decided to produce the opposite of it instead. Chow stayed. She was, it turned out, one of the sharper analytical minds on the board when she wasn't operating under external pressure. And the thing that had been used to pressure her was addressed in a process that Victoria had said would be handled separately, and was. Mason didn't know the details of that either. He didn't need to. Hartwell remained exactly what she'd appeared to be in the board meeting. Observant, fair, occasionally brisk, consistently the board member who asked the question that needed asking before other people had formulated it yet. The Sterling Consolidated Protection Infrastructure rebuild took 6 months in full. Nadia stayed for the first 3 as a contract consultant and was offered a permanent position at the end of them, which she accepted after a week of consideration that she described to Mason as making sure the money was right and the work was real, both of which she determined were true. Brendan turned out to be indispensable in ways that expanded beyond his original data visualization function, and Victoria promoted him twice in 4 months, which made Hargrove mildly resentful in a way he managed professionally and didn't mention more than 4 or 5 times. Hargrove's cast came off in the 3rd week. He celebrated by writing in his notepad with both hands simultaneously, which was not a thing that served any practical purpose, and which he did anyway. What Mason noticed in the months that followed the Tuesday that had started everything was something he didn't have precise language for. It was not happiness exactly, though it was in the neighborhood. It was not resolution, because nothing was fully resolved. The work was ongoing, the situations were developing. Lily had entered 3rd grade and had opinions about her new teacher that required regular processing. The apartment was the same apartment with the same small rooms, but the refrigerator was quiet now, and the heat bill was manageable, and there was, for the first time in 7 years, a margin. What it was, he thought, was something more like rightness. The specific quality of doing a thing that you were built for, in a context that used what you actually had rather than a simplified version of it. The camera above exit 1 was correctly positioned now, and he'd checked it himself on the first Monday and again on the following Friday, and it was where it should be, and he'd noted that and moved on. Small things. The daily work of attention. He picked Lily up from school on Tuesdays and Thursdays. On Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays, Mrs. Paula did pickup, which she had been doing for 4 years, and which she continued to do with the same cheerful competence, accepting the improved compensation arrangement with less drama than Mason had expected and more quiet satisfaction. Mrs. Paula had been right years ago when she'd started filling the space that was empty in his life with soup and attention and accurate observations he hadn't asked for. She'd been doing what good people did in proximity to someone who needed things but didn't know how to name the need. She'd just kept showing up. He thought about that a lot. The people who kept showing up. One evening in the 6th month, he and Victoria were working late in the conference room. It had become a regular thing. The late evenings, not because the work required it exactly, but because the work was better when it had space, and the space was easier to find at 7 p.m. than at 2 in the afternoon. And Lily had fallen asleep on the conference room couch at the far end of the room, which was a couch that had appeared in the 3rd month when Victoria had said there should be a couch in this room, and Hargrove had arranged for one without asking why. Lily was asleep with her jacket folded under her head and her shoes still on, the spy grandmother book open on her chest at a page she'd been reading, and the room had the quality of something that had organized itself around her presence without discussion. Victoria was looking at a document. Mason was looking at the window, thinking through a protocol question that didn't have a clean answer yet. After a while, Victoria said without looking up, she finished the grandmother book. Last week. She's decided the cover story was implausible but forgivable because the grandmother was otherwise competent. Victoria almost smiled. The full version, not the adjacent one. He'd started to learn the difference in the months since Tuesday, the specific distinctions of her expressions, which was not something he'd planned to learn and which had happened the way things happened when you paid attention over time. That's a reasonable standard, Victoria said. It's her standard for most things, he said. Implausible, but forgivable if otherwise competent. Victoria looked at him, then at Lily on the couch, then back at the document. Mason, she said. Yeah, thank you. She said it simply, without preamble, which was how she said things that mattered to her. Directly, without the architecture of let-up. For Tuesday, for Monday, for... She paused. For the coffee. He thought about the place without a story. He thought about the crease in his shoulder that still wasn't right. He thought about a camera 3 degrees off axis and what it meant to notice a thing like that and keep noticing things like that for years and years, until the noticing was just how you existed in the world. The coffee's easy, he said. Nothing about any of this has been easy, she said. No, he said, but it's been worth it. He paused. I think that's the thing, finally, that it's worth it. She looked at him for a moment. Across the room, Lily shifted on the couch and resettled, the book sliding slightly on her chest, her socked feet crossing at the ankles. Worth it, Victoria said, quietly, like she was placing the phrase somewhere. Yeah, he said. They went back to work. Outside, the city was doing what it did, perpetual, indifferent, full of ordinary things that were also, from certain angles, extraordinary. The lights of it came through the conference room windows and lay across the floor and across the table and across the drawing that was still 3 months later on Victoria's desk. Not in a drawer, on the desk, where she'd said it was. The tree with the extensive roots and the 3 figures under the branches, drawn by a 7-year-old who understood that the part you couldn't see was the part that held everything up. Mason looked at the window. He looked at his daughter asleep on the couch. He thought, this is what it is. Not a resolution, not a conclusion. Just the ongoing thing, the daily practice, the small attentions accumulated over time until they add up to something with structural integrity. He thought, show up, pay attention, do the work in front of you. He thought, that's enough. It's always been enough. He picked up his pen and got back to work.